Hello everyone, welcome to a live webcast with LaRoucheSupport TV. It's December 17th. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRoucheSupport.com. And our featured guests today are Sky Shields and Cody Jones, two members of LaRouche's basement science research team. We have live audiences gathered all around the world today. I know in about half a dozen cities across the United States, plus several continents worldwide. We have multiple questions already coming in from around the world. And I encourage you, if you haven't sent a question yet, right now or during the course of the proceedings today, please send your question into info.larouchepack@gmail.com. Now, we are living under a very awful moment in human history. At the same time that we have the imminent collapse of the entire transatlantic monetary system, we're also finding ourselves on the eve of what will truly be a destructive thermonuclear world war. And this is the kind of situation in which Lyndon LaRouche has warned us that merely days, if not hours, we may find ourselves at not only the end of Western civilization, but maybe even possibly the kinds of events which will lead to the extinction of the human race. Now, this confrontation between the United States and the two nations which should be our greatest allies on this planet, Russia and China, has been the intention of the British Empire ever since the murder of a captive head of state, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. The perfunctory assassination of this captive head of state was declared in order to clear the way for the immediate beginning of this kind of build-up towards war. Now, nobody except for Lyndon LaRouche at that point was willing to say that this was intended to be a thermonuclear confrontation. But now that several weeks have gone by, it's clear from the evidence all around the world that that is exactly what we're facing right now. Now, Lyndon LaRouche's actions to jam up this drive for war have delayed the danger, but have by no means put us in a position of safety. The response by certain leading generals inside the United States, patriotic circles inside Russia, not to mention inside Israel, have put this thing on hold for the time being, but we are not safe for as long as this President Barack Obama remains in the White House. Now, the actions of Obama just this week have confirmed everything that Lyndon LaRouche has warned you about him. We are facing a situation where we have Adolf Hitler in the White House. The enabling acts that this president pushed through this week and that the Congress conceded to have put us in the position in which any U.S. citizen who this president deems an enemy of his political intentions could be swept off the street, jailed indefinitely without trial, and even executed. Now, what we've also seen from Barack Obama this week is the murderous expression of his homicidal narcissism in the form of the attack that he's waged against Hillary Clinton. Now, people saw what Hillary Clinton had to say after the Russian parliamentary elections, but what Lyndon LaRouche was very clear to say in a statement that he put out called "Was It Hillary's Error?" was that this was, in fact, the collusion of Barack Obama with Mikhail Gorbachev and other known traitors of the nation of Russia to set up Hillary Clinton in order to force her to repudiate what might have been her most proud accomplishment as Secretary of State, the so-called reset between the United States and Russia. Now, this has put us in the position where we are days, if not hours, away from a thermonuclear confrontation with our would-be allies. And several forms of collaboration over the recent months have come through, offers of open hand of collaboration from Russia to the United States, starting at the end of last year with the offers to build a collaborative project to build a bridge across the Bering Straits between Alaska and Siberia, the offers to have joint development of the Arctic Circle, a subject which we'll be taking up here today, offers to work together under the rubric of a project named IGMAS to put out a extended sensorium of satellite monitoring devices, Earth-based and space-based, to track severe weather precursors, including precursors for earthquake prediction. And now the most recent is the so-called SDE, the Strategic Defense of Earth, an explicit revival of Lyndon LaRouche's SDI. Now, under the influence of the British Empire, the United States every step along the way, has either ignored or rejected these offers of collaboration from our would-be allies inside Russia under this presidency. Why? Because he is a direct agent of the enemies of the human race inside the British Empire, as Lyndon LaRouche has dubbed it, the fourth incarnation of the Roman Empire, who have as their stated intention the reduction of the world's population from 7 billion to less than 1. So this is truly an awesome moment of world history. I think the question that all of us have to answer is, are we ready? The responsibility of every single one of us, each and every one of us, are we ready to take the responsibility to answer the question ourselves? Is mankind fit to survive, morally and intellectually? And an even better question is, do we even know what mankind is? So with that, without any further ado, I'd like to repeat, if you have questions during the course of today's proceedings, please send them in to info.larouchepack@gmail.com. And we will be answering them after opening remarks coming from Sky Shields and Cody Jones. So I'd like to, very proud to introduce to you Sky Shields.
I'd like here to take up a theme that's been, Mr. LaRouche has been taking up in a series of papers recently. He's just now ending a series where he's tackling some of the most pushing for a revolutionary breakthrough in the understanding of the basic principles of physical economics. Now we'll see what that means is something much broader than you might think, because what he's laid out in these papers will, by pushing for revolution in our understanding of economic policy, we're going to see a revolution in both the physical sciences, but probably more significantly in the science of the human mind. He's just now ending this series. I got a chance to see a preview today of the last paper in it. And what I'd like to cover today will be a sort of case study to illustrate some of the ideas as they're coming up, to give people a flavor of what we're going to have a chance to wrestle with. And we'll use a specific case study, as Matt just said, of the development of the Arctic regions of our planet. So to set the stage here, the theme I'd like to take up, and it's been a thread through all of these recent papers, is the difference between mind and brain. Now this is fundamental. You were discussing, where does the location of the human individual lie? Right now this is important for a number of reasons. As Matt just said, it's important for the population as a whole because of just what you've seen from the acts you've seen recently from our Congress and from our supposed representatives in the U.S. government, which is that you've seen what, by any measure, should be considered to be several acts of insanity. Not only the rejection of these offers for collaboration on some projects, which I'll discuss here, are absolutely amazing, but what seems to be the blind, lunatic drive towards self-destruction. What's clear and evident self-destruction in the form of a thermonuclear conflict, what inevitably will have to be a thermonuclear conflict if it's carried out, between the U.S., Russia, and then more broadly. It should be clear to anybody who's looking at this, anybody who's paying any attention at all to the situation, that what we're risking right here is the destruction of the entire human species. And in fact, you see, when you take a look at the responses, you take a look at some of these figures in Congress and elsewhere, when they see what they've done in capitulating to Obama, capitulating on his recent moves in the last couple of days towards solidifying a police state within a dictatorship within the U.S. and abroad, and you can see from their actions that they do recognize what they've done. You get the immediate response, that you get a sense of shame. But despite their ability to recognize the destruction that they're bringing upon themselves and us, they still drive forward with the exact same policy. Buried in that action, or lying behind that action, is a very specific kind of pathology, which we'll get to the core, which, if we can get to the core of that pathology, we'll get to the core of some rather amazing and exciting principles, even given the current threat, but principles which, if taken up and understood clearly, would be our way out of this current crisis. The main one to tackle here is the question of the sense of personal identity. Now, again, this is where this concept of mind versus brain becomes essential, because it's common in probably the most simplistic, animalistic state that a human being could get into, and the most debased state a human being can get into. There is a tendency to identify your self-identity with your physical body. And this is what you tend to call I. The question is, what in the world do you identify with as I, as the me? Over the last several decades, with the collapse in the quality of culture in the United States and abroad, you've seen a destruction, an inability to identify with more profound states of me. That is to say, in better periods of U.S. history, people, your self-identification would tend to be with things that would be considered to be outside of your physical existence, outside of your physical body. That's both in space, that is, you would identify with all of human society. At the very least, you'd identify with a nation. You'd have an idea that your sense of self-preservation was not simply keeping your own physical body alive, but it was managing a society. And it would also extend beyond the bounds of your body in time. You had the idea that what your sense of self-preservation is not maintaining your own lifetime, but what's more important is you maintaining the existence of the human species over the course of several generations. You had a sense of your continued effectiveness, and this might take various forms if you were to try and identify it. People would have a sense of their legacy. You'd have a sense of your children, your grandchildren, other people's children and grandchildren, the children and grandchildren of an entire society. I think just intuitively, people recognize this. You recognize the person with that kind of sense as being somebody who's got a virtuous person, somebody whose sense of identity is above, getting close to something that's actually respectable. This is not simply an arbitrary sense. The recognition that is a desirable quality of mind, to identify with something outside of your physical self, is not simply, it's not a matter of opinion. Do some people like this quality of morality, other people not? This is actually, there's a scientific principle embedded behind this, which is that, in fact, the part of the human eye that you would call the I, this mind, is not in any way physically, not in any way limited to the body in which you seem to inhabit. In fact, the thing that you call mind, the part of you that you call you, is not simply localizable in space or in time. And we'll discuss this in some detail, but that scientific fact is the basis for what is often termed in religious terminology or theological terminology as the immortality of the human soul. This is not simply a sentiment. It's not something magical and airy-fairy descended from above. It's a hard fact about the way the physical universe operates, that the human individual is not localized to the human body. If we can start to get that sense, if we have that understanding of what the actual character of the human individual is, then we have the ability to start to tackle, only then do we have the ability to start to tackle questions of physical economics. Because in questions of human society, questions of physical economics, this is really the process that we're looking at. The substance of our discussion in these areas lies in that domain of human mind, whereas the shadows of it are what we see as accessible by are those objects which seem to be accessible to the human body. Now, what this means is that most of the types of measurement, the types of considerations that pass for economics now, are not in the domain of actual cause. They don't lie in the domain of actual mind. The measurements that are taken up by typical so-called economists, really accountants, are values which lie in the domain of the body, in the domain of sense perception, or even below, in the domain of absolute fiction. Now, in the case of monetarist policies, the sort that you will hear expressed by earlier an Alan Greenspan, now a Bernanke, any of these figures who would tend to present themselves as the experts in economic policy, the stock markets, really simply monetarists. This falls below the level of any consideration at all. This is simply a fiction at best, a willfully murderous fiction at its most usual expression. So that will scrap. A second approximation, which might seem to be better than monetarism, monetary values to measure the status of a physical economy, might tend to be the physical state of the economy. What most people in the population right now are feeling as a collapse, which is the collapse in employment, real productive employment, the collapse in the educational system, the collapse in this insane wave of foreclosures that you have sweeping the country right now. People are losing their homes, they're losing their jobs, they're losing their ability to eat. In particular, when you look at the situation globally, you're watching a clear meltdown in certain physical parameters, clearly measurable physical parameters. This is real. This is very real. But an examination of those parameters themselves, simply those physical parameters per se, will not bring us to the economic core of the matter, the actual causality we face here. In order to look at the actual causality of the recent collapse, both in the U.S. and abroad, we have to take a look at something which has the same relation to those physical characteristics as the human mind has to the human brain. That is to say, the actual substance of what we call economy, the substance of what we call human society, exists in a realm that's invisible to the senses directly, though its effects are clearly visible. And in fact, the survival of the human species depends on its effects. This might be what we discuss as the social aspect of mind, or what Vernadsky termed the noosphere, as opposed to the biosphere, the domain of human activity. Now we'll take a look at its effects and what the recognition of its existence means for policy right now by looking at some cases, again, specifically the case of Russia as a nation, but then the potential for development that we see in the recent offers for collaboration with the United States. To give you a sense of where we stand right now, I think many people watched very closely the recent launch of this Phobos Grunt spacecraft, which was meant to be, it was launched on a Russian launch vehicle carrying instruments from various countries. The plan was, the quite impressive plan for this instrument was that it was going to travel all the way from Earth to Mars's moon Phobos, collect a sample of soil, bring this soil back for the first time ever, for us to have first time ever have soil from some planetary body besides the moon to study here on the ground on Earth. And there are a number of very impressive experiments attached to this. A number of ones carrying living organisms through interplanetary space to observe the effect of that interplanetary medium on the development of life. It would give us insight into what are the actual conditions, the non-reductionist conditions for the development of life on Earth, and it would be a basis, add to the discussion for the expanding our understanding of what life actually is, as opposed to simply living processes. Unfortunately, the original launch vehicle, the actual launch vehicle of this spacecraft, functioned successfully. It was able to get the spacecraft into orbit, but the rockets that were meant to fire after that to take the spacecraft out of Earth orbit and begin its trajectory towards Mars, these failed. Now, there's been a few cases of resumed communication. Not with the spacecraft, not clear enough to figure out exactly the nature of the problem, and not soon enough to be able to continue the spacecraft on its mission to Mars. So it is lost as far as that specific mission goes. What makes this interesting to us is because it gives us a measure of collapse. To begin with, it gives us a foothold to discuss to look at a physical measure of collapse over the recent period. Now, this is the collapse that's happened in Russia during the course of the period of the implementation of free trade looting policies. This is after the fall of the Soviet Union. Throughout the course of the 90s, you have what was correctly known as a criminal revolution in Russia. This was the bringing in of Western interests, various interests who represented British imperial policies, international financial policies, typified by Wall Street in London, and bringing these looting policies into Russia for a mass looting of, the raw material resources of Russia. You saw a massive sell-off of basically everything, anything that you would consider to be a resource owned by the nation, intended for the development of the people, was sold out of the country to various Western interests. But more significantly, and this is you saw a visible looting, a very visible collapse. But what drove this visible collapse, and what eventually aggravated it to have lasting effects to this day, is that you saw an overall cultural collapse, a looting in the domain of mind, as opposed to a looting in the domain of the brain or physical body. Now, the looting you saw here expressed itself in a collapse in potential, and physical economic potential. Now, what are the expressions of this potential? Again, take a look at what we saw with the Phobos-Grunz satellite. What do you see behind this process? On the face of it, you see a spacecraft which was unsuccessful. Underneath it, though, you look a little bit beneath the surface, and what you see the results of 25 years of collapse. It was pointed out that when you take a look now at the Russian space program, and you look at the ages of the people involved, almost everybody involved in it, the vast majority are over the age of 60, or under the age of 30. That is, an entire generation vanished in that period of looting. What happened? This was not simply a looting of the resources, of physical resources, etc. More significantly, you saw a destruction of the intellectual capability of the population, the intellectual moral capability. Now, this is what happens when you create these kinds of conditions where the nation now defines profit in terms of free trade. You define profit in terms of immediate physical gain. What you're doing there is you're creating the objective conditions to reduce the identity of an individual to the confines of that individual's body. You're putting a premium on punishing an individual for having any kind of a long-term view. For instance, people will recognize the current state of financial policy here in the U.S. as an example of it. Things that you see in the derivatives market, that you see in the housing market. The idea that you make an investment in the stock market for an immediate turnover. You buy one day and you sell the next day. The real insanity that you saw typified in films and in the culture of the 1980s. You are training people. You're giving the incentive to train people to cease to identify with any long-term processes. You're creating the objective conditions that force the individual to identify with time constraints that are well within the lifetime of the human individual. You're reducing them in that sense to the state of an animal as opposed to the state of an actual human individual, as we discussed before. And so in Russia, you saw this. You saw immediate collapse of the ability to provide for the front-end scientific resources that had been the characteristic of the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet Union, Russia was able to launch spacecraft to Mars and Venus at a pace of about one every 2 years, and that's about the ideal given the possible relationships between the planetary positions of the Earth, Venus, Mars. Now, during the collapse, though, you had an inability to maintain the skilled labor who would take part in those kinds of projects, and you saw a number of things happen. For a number of the skilled scientific cadre were forced to flee the country because of the conditions. Others who stayed were siphoned off into other areas. The insane mathematics of the derivatives market, in fact, siphoned off a number of skilled rocket engineers and other people. The only people who would have the mathematics education to understand something as absurd as the derivatives market were siphoned off into financial speculation, financial activity, as opposed to the actual productive activity that they were involved in prior. You also saw in the schooling the educated youth who would normally be involved in this sort of a project, who you'd be bringing in to work in the space program, the ones who would be in that age bracket between 30 and 60 now, those youth were redirected into other interests if they could get access to university education. These youth were directed into the areas of so-called business, financial activity, etc., because these were considered to be the profitable areas. So at the same time as you have this utter collapse physically, underneath the surface you have a much more insidious collapse as far as the psychological and scientific capability of a nation. Now, again, a number of other figures echo this. During the period of the introduction of free trade policy, you see a massive spike in rates of drug use throughout Russia. You see a massive spike in the orphaned children, a spike in death rates, a spike in HIV infection. All of these were seen as a direct result of the economic conditions that were created with the implementation of globalization and the looting post the fall of the Soviet Union. That's not to say there were problems, serious problems, which had already led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the first place. But as opposed to taking a better turn, what you saw was a turn decidedly for the worst. Now take careful note of the character of that collapse beneath the surface. Because that collapse that you see beneath the surface inside of Russia is exactly the same quality of collapse you see beneath the surface here in the United States and abroad. This is what you're looking at. Again, what you can see around you is a physical breakdown, but the actual cause beneath that physical breakdown is the invisible one that is happening in the domain of mind, in the domain of principle. If we can take a look at the first animation here, it'll sort of give you an idea. Now, if you take this bottom curve here, and can we pause it? Take this bottom curve here as our baseline, and then the upper curve, we can pause with the upper curve on there, that's fine, as an actual. This is just a simple visualization to give you an idea, just to give you a simple feel for it. I'm obviously not done using any specific figures or anything like that. But if you take a look, in general, in the development of a human society, as we see in the development of the biosphere as a whole, the baseline requirements for an economic quantity known as energy flux density, that is in general the throughput over given the overall physical productive throughput of a physical economy, these steadily increase over time for various objective reasons. The most simplistic of all would be the simple consumption of an existing resource base. That there's no such thing as simply standing still relative to some background state. You can see for this reason that the necessity of the inapplicability here of a Newtonian concept of space or time. There is no absolute background against which physical processes unfold. In fact, there's a sort what you might call a moving background. And what you're examining are these relative rates of anti-entropy, of anti-entropic development. Now, whatever your increase or decrease is in terms of your actual physical economic throughput of an economy, it has to be increasing at such a rate that it's the margin, you're maintaining a proper margin of difference between what is required and then what you're capable of actually producing. Can we show the next animation, actually? And it's to give us an idea of where we stand right now. if we can stop it here. So we take a look here. So what you would say, this is, we'll present sort of two concepts here quickly. One is that when you see a collapse in potential, and we'll discuss, there's a couple of elements we won't discuss in detail, but some of the terms that a couple of key concepts Lyndon LaRouche introduces in his physical economy are, one major one, potential relative population density. When you see a collapse in your ability to maintain your population at a certain density, at a certain standard of living within a certain land area, when you see a collapse in the potential, what I think should be obviously the case is that even though it's not immediate, at some time in the future you're going to see a collapse in the actual expression of that value, of your actual physical population density, relative population density. In the event that you do see a collapse below a certain break-even point, if you do not manage to raise yourself up above break-even, the physical results of that are going to be disastrous. You're going to see that balance itself out in some form whose character is predictable, even though specifics aren't. For example, right now what we're seeing internationally is you're watching the collapse of the entire transatlantic financial system. If we weren't in the middle of it, it would be a very interesting study, because it's not clear exactly which part of this thing will blow first. You're looking at a dam with 1,000 holes in it. Any one of those things could break. The only thing that's clear is that this thing must break, and that anybody who's committed to try and hold this thing together must push for an in-game scenario, which is what you're seeing with the drive towards nuclear war. Now, the exact avenues by which that might unfold are open. They narrow, but they're open. What's necessary is that the end occurs in the form it occurs if certain actions aren't taken to raise us above break-even. But now, what's required in order to raise ourselves above break-even here? The character of this we can see by doing a study of the recent proposal and recent actions taken by Russia. Can we actually skip ahead 2 animations? Yes. Skip ahead to number 7. Sorry, number 7. Now, what you're looking at here is something that's actually wonderful. This is a seasonal view from NASA of some recent years of Arctic sea ice. Now, what's been happening recently, over the course of recent years, is you've seen a steady decrease in the amount of sea ice in the northern polar region of the planet, of the globe. This one doesn't play through the second half, I take it, huh? Okay, that's fine. But we're going to see, likely this coming summer, the first entirely ice-free summer there in the Arctic. Now, this is wonderful. You're getting the cries from a lot of lunatic environmentalists that this is terrible, etc. What about the polar bears? I think the polar bears will do fine. They're doing fine. It'll be cool. As a quick parenthetical, they're also attempting to try and link this melting of the sea ice to global warming. Just for those of us who didn't know, it's a very funny paradox is occurring right now with the melting of this sea ice, which is that there are a lot of forecasts about how much the planet would warm and then how much the sea ice would melt. Now, and they had these very elaborate models that were presented to the IPCC. Everybody was tossing around discussing it. But if you take a look at the actual models, all of them, and you take a look at what's actually occurring right here, even what they call global mean temperature, which we can again discuss, is actually a meaningless term. But even by their definition of it, that temperature has increased less than they forecast. But if you take a look at the melting of the Arctic ice, that's increased far more than anybody forecast. Now, everybody right now is in a race and a scramble to try and redo their models so that they can try and reconnect the ice to the warming again. But and eventually they will make up a new story, because they'll always make up a story to try and connect these things. But what's significant here is that there's other factors at play which are causing, and there always have been, other more complex factors at play, causing the reduction in the Arctic sea ice there. That's something to discuss. We'll have a chance to study there. But what's most interesting for us is how absolutely exciting it is that you've got a new region of the world opening up. The opening up of this region of the world will give us the margin that we need to make up for the collapse in the recent period. In particular, Russia's moves there are going to be exactly what they need to make up for the collapse that we saw in causing the problems for the launching of this Phobos-Grunt satellite. Now, why is this? Take a look at the Arctic region here. We can take this map, this next one. Now, the measure for what you would call the current measure for the potential relative population density of this region is close to nil. You take a look at the amount of population that's sustainable in this area under current standards is obviously nothing. Take the conditions up here far, far north in the Arctic Circle. You've got places where we'll take a look at this one island here where you see the arrow there as an example. This Kotelny Island off the Russian coast. The temperature there is most of the year. The temperature there is lower than minus 30 degrees Celsius. So you've got conditions there that aren't very conducive to any life at all. Even when in the warmer periods, it rarely gets at all above freezing. The conditions you have here are not, you might say, at first blush, not conducive to human life or really any life. First, not entirely true, because if you take a look, there actually is some very interesting life there, which we'll have a chance to discuss in the question and answer section. But it sort of brings out, looking at the difficulty of living and surviving in this region, brings to mind, well, it'll show up a very important principle of human development, which is that, I'll take a quick parenthetical to discuss this. We as humans, as the only willfully cognitive species on the planet, in the galaxy, and the universe, very likely, possibly, we find ourselves in a very interesting position, which is that we are born with a certain set of capabilities that we didn't have much say in directly. That is, the idea that we've got 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, etc. A certain physiology that we've got, we didn't have a lot of say in. The fact that we live in the biosphere that we live in, we didn't have a lot of say in. In fact, the initial things that maintain us and sustain us in this biosphere were not something that were subject to our actual conscious decision-making. In fact, as a species, in that way, we're remarkably similar to a baby in the womb who appears in the womb, doesn't have a lot of say initially over what keeps it alive. You've got an attachment with your umbilical cord, and you've got certain nutrients that are being fed to you through your umbilical cord to keep the baby alive and developing, etc. But now, just as with that baby in the womb, that's not a position you can stay in for in a very extended period of time. You got about 9 months before it becomes uncomfortable for both you and the original owner of that womb. As you were to stay there 3-4 years, obviously this would be something, bad things would result. And instead, you've got, at a certain point, you have to decide, or you're forced to decide, that it's time to leave and find other means of taking your own nutrients. Those things that were originally provided for you through the umbilical cord, through the environment of the womb, you suddenly have to provide for yourself using your hands and your mouth and these other instruments that you developed in the womb but you didn't make much use of necessarily. There's not much use for the hands or the mouth or the legs within the womb except to kick and to give notice of your presence, that you're there. The human species finds itself in the exact same position. That is, we were given this womb-like environment of Earth where food grows on trees. They say, what do you think, food grows on trees? Well, here it does. Here it does, as long as you're here in the womb on Earth. In the actual further destiny of the human species, it doesn't necessarily. That the survival of the human species, even as Cody will discuss a little bit later, even understanding the phenomena that hit us here on Earth, weather phenomena, the things that we're normally subject to on the ground, requires our leaving the confines of this planet for the simple things. There's no way to understand earthquakes without understanding Earth-Sun relationships. There's no way to understand tornadoes. Various kinds of natural disasters here we find with the climate here require us to leave the confines of this planet and to look for the actual source of these causes. The defending the human species against something like an asteroid strike, which could result in our near or complete extinction, requires our expanding outward. Again, this is the position we find ourselves in, is very much like that baby being pushed head first out of the womb. If you stay in there any longer, you're going to die. Umbilical cord's broken, sack's gone. You can hang out and drown if you like, but you've got to actually move outward and forward if you want to maintain your survival and your species' survival. But now to do that requires the development of certain key technologies that even though we began our motion into space, we only began to touch on, which is creating the kinds of recreating in a more efficient way the sorts of biospheric systems that we thrive on here on Earth. Now, so what does that mean for the case of the Arctic? Take a look. There's a recent proposal which I'm going to look at just as a case study, not necessarily as the one to approve, but this is something that President Putin saw at a conference in September at the Second International Arctic Forum, titled "The Arctic Territory of Dialogue." This was the plans to build. Actually, can we back up one? Just a quick one. On this island here, this island Kotelny off the coast of Russia, to establish on that island a domed city. Now, this domed city will be modeled on the ISS, the International Space Station. And the idea is to build a city here which is completely isolated from the Arctic environment, where you won't recognize that you've got below freezing temperatures outside, and inside you'll have a temperate environment, which is exciting to begin with. But then what makes this, what is the relationship between a city like this and the International Space Station? It's that you need to master the key cycles that maintain the biosphere here on Earth, need to be mastered in order to maintain this city as a habitable city, which means that the system of gas exchange is going to be almost entirely self-contained. You're not going to have any openings with the frigid air outside of the environment there. This means carefully understanding key cycles between human activity, animal activity, plant life, etc. Because there's only certain times in the year where you'd be capable of bringing shipments there, and ideally you wouldn't want shipments brought in for food, etc. The idea is to make the environment completely self-sustainable agriculturally. You want to create the conditions where all your plant and animal life is grown, developed there. The waste is processed there. There's no waste, or as little waste as possible, which leaves it. They're aiming for zero waste leaving. All these are the kinds of conditions, the kind of energy density, the concentration of biospheric activity that would be required to survive in interplanetary space. In fact, the designer of this city has proposed it to be a model for the future colonization of the Moon and Mars. And in general, if we have an eye to this arc, that mankind's destiny is in the stewardship of the entire solar system and beyond, we have an eye to that, we've got the ability to concentrate the resources and develop the technological capability and spillover, which will be here in the Arctic, which will be applied abroad. And again, if we take a look at the map here, where the island is, the same design has been proposed for the entire Arctic region here. Now, Russia is on the move, pushing these. They've been expanding their development into their far east, into the north, building links of rail line and proposing links of rail line that are going to heading themselves up towards Russia's side of the Bering Strait. Now, actually, we could skip ahead to give a picture well, let's do. If we combine this with what people have seen discussed on the website recently, which is a project known as the North American Water and Power Alliance, NWAPA. If we can take a look at what this is, NWAPA has some of the most significant aspects of NWAPA are in the same region of the Arctic as we're seeing these other developments take place. If you take a look, the program for NWAPA is to take, you see here the runoff from various rivers, and look at the massive amount of runoff that lands in Alaska, northern Canada, and simply runs immediately back out into the ocean. The thickness of the arrows here indicates the amount of runoff there. The idea of NWAPA is to capture 20% of that water in Alaska and northern Canada that would be lost otherwise, and instead direct that back down through Alaska, through northern Canada, through North America, and use it to irrigate the Great American Deserts that are shared between the United States, the Great American Desert shared between the United States and Russia, but along the way to be utilized in various types of economic development, hydropower development, reservoirs, etc. The rail systems connect. Well, first let's get a little closer look at what this means in Alaska. The next one. Now we're going to get close up of this region here. That's that region there shared between Alaska and Canada. So the region there in red, let's zoom into that there. Actually, the next image. This is what we're looking at here. This is Alaskan-Canadian border. You can see the systems of reservoirs there. Now this is going to entail quite a bit of construction, and that doesn't already exist in the state of Alaska and in northern Canada. Going to require the building altogether of 6 dams, 3 of them over 1,000 feet. In order to bring the workers and supplies in there, it's going to require construction of about 3,000 miles of rail in Alaska alone, about 7,000 miles of rail in northern Canada, including 4 more dams in northern Canada. This is a massive amount of construction. This is going to require the development of several key cities to house the workforce which will be involved in this construction here. Can we take the next image? Now we're obviously not going to leave that alone once the rail is constructed. These are the cities here, and we'll see them linked up by the rail through Alaska, through Canada. Once this rail is constructed there, you see in the top left, we're well situated to build the natural evolution of that rail development across the Bering Strait and into Russia. Now, you realize what we discussed before. This is going to meet up with construction that's presently being accomplished in Russia, in their far east and in their north. Now, this is going to give us a very different view of the world. Can we take the next image? Give you a shot of the Bering Strait development, just give an idea of a view from above, what we're talking about, and somewhere the key city construction will be. You see Alaska here on your right, northern Siberia there on your left. Give us a little zoom in here. These islands, Big Diomede, Little Diomede. Can we go to the next image? Now this is going to give us a very different map of the world, moving so we see we're going to get a shift from our Atlantic view of the world. So here's our view from the Atlantic Ocean. It's a very specific map of the world. Now pause it here, could we? Now the question is, an interesting way to sort of look at this, what do you mean when we're discussing space and time from a physical economic standpoint, what do you consider to be far? From this map of the world pretty much agrees with the impression that you have of the way the world is connected right now. The places like Alaska are very far away. These are at the fringes of the world, at the far edges. Northern Canada is at the fringes of the world. It's very far away. It's at the edge of what we see. Play it. But the connection we're talking about here gives you sort of a different idea of near and far. In fact, you'll notice here that the shortest route from Europe into North America is here, through this region here, across the polar regions. Both with the rail connection here, and what we don't have on the map here, but you can imagine, there's 3 key shipping routes for this polar region here, which are now opening up with the melting of the Arctic sea ice. And these are the shipping routes that will go along the Northern Sea Route, which will go along the northern coast of Russia from Europe, from ports in Russia's northwest, all the way around Russia, following essentially the same route as we see for the Eurasian land bridge toward the Bering Strait, and then potentially down through the Bering Strait towards the Pacific coast of the United States, or across the Northwest Passage through northern Canada to the farther side, over towards the Atlantic. Now, this is going to be about, the distance of shipping here is about half the distance it would be through something like the Suez Canal. But more importantly than, in general, the efficiency, fuel efficiency, etc., is much more rapid utilizing these polar regions. That's secondary to the fact that you're seeing now the ability to take a region of the universe which was formerly inhospitable to man and making it hospitable. Can we take a look at the next one? And this is what it's going to enable us to do, to push for a complete... What you're seeing here now is a reflection of an entirely different view of the human species. This is the world from the eyes of a spacefaring species. And this is the only kind of construction that's going to allow us to make up for the recent collapse. That is, not only regain our ability to operate in space, undo the collapse of the Russian space program, undo the destruction that Obama has launched here within the United States against the U.S. space program, but to take us even farther than we ever were before towards being a spacefaring species, capable of inhabiting the Arctic and, by extinction, the Moon, the Mars, etc. In fact, this is going to link us up all the way from the southern tip of Africa, through Europe, through Asia, through North America, down to the southern tip of South America. It'll link us pole to pole for the first time ever, from, again, the tip of Chile and Argentina, very near the South Pole, all the way up to the Bering Strait near the North Pole. It will allow us to introduce a new sport which will enrage environmentalists, hopefully, if they still exist, which will be maybe the first time, we may be the first people ever to be able to feed a penguin to a polar bear. And this will be a cause for much excitement. We might use that to Christian some part of the route here. But in general, it will represent what needs to be a fundamental cultural renaissance. In order to accomplish this, though, we're going to have to tackle what will come up in further in Cody's presentation and in the question and answer, this fundamental distinction between the human mind and the human brain, again, not simply within the body of the human individual, but within the context of society and the physical universe as a whole. That is, we're going to have to master the physical significance, the ontological significance of the human mind, and to use that as the basis for policy making over the next several decades and beyond. So that'll give us just, we can start with that and then move forward.
Today I'd like to present an idea with the personality of a fugue, with many different lines of thought acting against each other but in harmony. The theme that will be used is one which has served the poets as an image for the imagination and has been provocative to many a scientist. From Shakespeare to Shelley, from Benjamin Franklin to Einstein, that theme is lightning. For most people, they have a very definite, probably a universal conception or an idea, impression of what lightning is. Usually we think of some streak, glowing streak that reaches from a cloud down to the ground, maybe associated with a loud thunderclap, and for some even the smell that tends to accompany a thunderstorm. But this is an image which is very much wholly associated with the very specific so-called inborn senses that we come out of the womb with. But what if we, for example, saw in the range of X-ray, or if we heard as with an antenna in the domain of radio, or we felt as if not with heat from infrared, but we felt frequencies in the very low or extremely low frequency range? What then might be our impression, our image of this thing that we call lightning? Now first I'd like to bring up an image here, which is the first image ever taken, X-ray image ever taken of a lightning strike. Now you'll see there's many different frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum represented in this picture. But I want to draw your attention to just the front portion of that strike, that very white hot portion right at the front end of that strike. That is the X-ray portion of that lightning strike. So if, for example, all you saw was in the domain of X-ray, to you, lightning would not be a streak from the cloud to the ground, but in fact would be more like a very hot, glowing ball that would shoot down at roughly a sixth the speed of light from a cloud to the ground. So already you'd have a different visual idea of what lightning is. Now, if, for example, we had a capability of hearing, so to speak, which was of the quality of an antenna, of a radio-tuned antenna, well, lightning would also have a very different sound to us. And George, if we could cue the whistler. So what you're hearing here is a antenna tuned to pick up the frequency that is emitted by lightning. Now it travels through a number of octaves of sound in the radio range, and it's largely due to the fact that lightning is sending a pulse all the way from Earth up to the magnetosphere and back down. Now the magnetosphere being that region where the magnetic field of the Earth interacts with the field from the sun. So you'd have a different quality of sound image of lightning. Now, as I said, what if you then felt, not as we feel on our skin, infrared radiation, it produced a certain heat sensation, but what if we were tuned sensually to feel extremely low frequency radiation emanating from the effects of lightning? Well, then we would find ourselves awash in a constant pulsing domain which was fueled by lightning. And we'll see an image of that, what's known as the Schumann resonances, which are created by lightning strikes, and then produce the video, please. So here you're seeing a video which depicts a representation of lightning striking and then the production of extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation, which then pulsates between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere and creates a constant kind of background pulsation in the Earth. So we'd have a very different feeling of what lightning in fact is. So now we have given a different set of senses, which fortunately science has provided us with, an extended sensorium. We have a very different impression of what lightning would be. We have a different visual impression of what we would call lightning. We have a different auditory impression of what we would call lightning. We'd have a very different sense, feeling impression of what we would call lightning. But yet, of course, those impressions still exist in the same universe, which has produced the sensations that we're more familiar with, the visual, auditory, smell sensations that we currently associate with lightning. So it begs the question, where does the reality of what we call lightning in fact lie? If any one set of impressions can be very different from another set of impressions, but yet both systems, so to speak, exist in the same universe, well, then maybe the reality is not in any one or even a number of these impressions, but the reality must be located elsewhere. This raises another very interesting question, which is why then, given just that very simple demonstration, why then do we continue to operate with a mathematics, with a geometry, and most commonly with a physics, which is still wholly based on the kinds of derivatives you get from the simple, immediate, out of the womb, so to speak, set of senses? For example, the whole idea of space that most people are familiar with comes from an idea that is derived effectively from a very visual-based notion of what the world is, of what the environment that we exist in is. That we have different objects which present themselves discretely, say, to our visual apparatus, like this microphone and this desk, for example. And visually I see that, well, seemingly there's nothing in between these two objects. And I could then go further and say, well, if I then removed all the objects from this room, I would still be left with this extension that I call space. And I could go further and say, well, I could remove all objects from the universe, so to speak, but yet I would still be left with this quality, this threefold extension that we call space. And it's really from that kind of false sense-based notion that much of current mathematics, physics, geometry has been derived. Things have been filled in the course of that, but always filled in against that kind of backdrop. Even to the extent that we do recognize that, yes, well, there are electrical fields, there are gravitational fields, there are all kinds of other fields present that we may not be able to immediately access through our God-given senses. Nonetheless, I still have to fill in everything relative to that initial impression of an empty space or a linear extension of time. So, let's get back to this theme of lightning. Let's go to this next image here of another image of the Schumann resonances. Now what you're seeing here is just a simple depiction of the harmonics that are created as this extremely low frequency, which is emitted by a lightning strike, starts to resonate and bounce between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere, where the wave gets trapped in a kind of a waveguide. Now it's going to set up certain harmonics which are themselves equal divisions of the Earth. Based off of the size of the Earth, that's what determines, and then its relationship to the ionosphere determines what are the harmonics of the Schumann resonances. And so here you see depicted, I think, a division into 3, 6, and then greater with the green one. And if we can go to the next image too, you'll see these are the frequencies, the peak frequencies, which correspond to that division of the Earth, which generate then your harmonics of the Schumann resonances. And the peak one, I think, there is what's at 7.83. Now, there's something very interesting to this, is that, one, this is constantly there as a pulsating kind of action in our environment. Something which we're not readily aware of, but which we can be made aware of through an extension of our senses, through the creation of the kind of apparatus that science has developed over the last couple of generations. Now, an aspect of this is that these various frequencies, these peak frequencies that we just saw on the Schumann resonance, correspond to also the background frequency of the mammalian brain itself. For example, the human brain, and people are familiar with, I think, some of this, and if we can go to the image here, what you're seeing is a simple depiction of EEG readings, which are effectively the brainwave readings, the emitted standing wave frequencies of the brain when it's at different activity levels, sleeping versus awake versus excited, etc. Now you'll notice that the frequencies that are depicted there are in the same general range as those frequencies that we have with the Schumann resonances. That in fact the brain itself, you could say, has been tuned or is in tune in a harmonic relationship with this background radiation, with this standing wave background electromagnetic pulse. Interestingly, and there's a lot of sort of wild hypotheses that we could start to posit at this point, the peak frequency of the Schumann resonance, the 7.83 hertz, does in fact correspond with what's known as, what's readily acknowledged as more of the deeper mentative state of the human brain. Whenever we're in a more relaxed, contemplative, thinking state, the frequency, EEG frequency, which tends to correspond with that, is in harmony with the peak frequency of the Schumann resonance. And I won't say too much more about that, and maybe in the Q&A we can get into some of the wilder implications of this. One thing that does come up, which is very interesting, is that they've done studies where they've done these kind of deprivation studies, where people were maintained deep under the earth in completely dark caves for days, weeks, months at a time. And so they had no access to clocks, no contact with the outside world through phone calls or anything, no access to sunlight, so they were deprived of any kind of external sensory input that would tell them what time of the day it is, whether it's night, etc. Now, despite that, people still maintain a sort of internal biological clock. They still maintain somewhat of a regular sleep cycle, a regular eating cycle. It was slightly shifted from what we typically think of as a 24-hour cycle, but nonetheless it was still a regular cycle. But whenever those same people were shielded from the Schumann resonances, where they set up a kind of shielding, all of the cycles were completely thrown out of whack. Now the eat cycle, the sense of time, the sleep cycle, all of these things were completely thrown out of whack once they were deprived now from the ability to tune in, so to speak, to the Schumann resonances. Which raises some very interesting questions about what kind of a role perhaps do the Schumann resonances play in biological functioning. Could not these resonant frequencies act as a way to maintain long-distance coherence, where a number of creatures of the same species, so to speak, are in a sense kept in a harmonic relationship with each other, kept in a kind of coherent relationship with each other through a tuning into the Schumann resonances? What other kind of information, so to speak, is transmitted along these frequencies? I mean, right now our reading of the resonance frequencies and what's contained there is still very limited. It would be almost as limited as if you had a simple radio receiver that could pick up, say, 88 hertz frequency on an antenna and would just vibrate at that frequency. That wouldn't tell you then what's all the so-called encoded information that's in that frequency. Now, if you have then the right kind of radio tuner, you can translate what seems like a simple 88 hertz into everything that we get through the radio, the news, whatever. So the question is, what else might there be embedded as communicated information, for lack of a better term, in these Schumann resonances? How does that coordinate certain kinds of activity among living creatures? How does that allow for certain long-range communication? How does that allow for the biological apparatus that's in one location to perhaps sense something that's happening in a very distant location. And already, just based off of that technique, we use the Schumann resonance to pinpoint where, for example, thunderstorms are on the globe. That if we had the right apparatus here in the studio, for example, we'd be able to determine, based off of reading of the Schumann resonance, where a thunderstorm was occurring somewhere else in the globe. So what other kinds of knowledge could we gain if we are effectively tuned in and extended our understanding of that? And what role do these Schumann resonances play in maintaining a certain coherence among living species, particularly mammals? Because as it is, they've done EEG readings of lizards and other lower types of life forms and haven't found the kind of coherent brain waves that you find in mammals, such as was represented with these EEG readings. But this goes even further. And you'll see this because, as I said, it is lightning strikes which produce this extremely low frequency Schumann resonance. Now let's go to the map, and you'll see the point I make here. What you're seeing is a global map that indicates density of thunderstorms, density of lightning strikes. And the darker colors are the more dense areas. The black is the densest, and it trails off down to the green and the blue. So you'll notice that the highest density of lightning strikes is occurring, 1, over land masses, and 2, over areas of land mass which are very densely forested, which have a lot of life. This brings up a very interesting idea. Life, some 300 plus million years ago, solely existed in the oceans. Prior to that, the land areas were pretty desolate. Not a lot of water on the land areas, they weren't green, there wasn't a whole lot going on there. But some 300 plus million years ago, life started to move out of the oceans onto land. In doing so, life brought the water cycle with them onto land. So that now you had, as life started to colonize and started to take over the land masses more and more, the potential was created for the trapping of water, the active movement of water up into the atmosphere, that which would fuel then the creation of cloud systems, and hence the creation of these lightning strikes. Now if you step back and think about that process, here again you have an example of life which, as we just discussed, is tuned to the Schumann resonant effect. Prior, 300 some million years ago, moving onto land and through the active movement on the land, the active movement of transporting the water cycle onto land, then fueling the formation of these cloud systems, in a sense created the conditions then through the lightning strikes and the consequent Schumann resonances, created the conditions then for future life to tap into and be tuned to this kind of global electromagnetic environment. So again, you have an example of life creating future conditions for an even more evolved existence of later life. And the Schumann resonances are something which are very key to this, as we said, and perhaps providing for this kind of long-range communication, etc. So we see in lightning something which itself is very intimate to the living process, to the evolutionary process. But that's only, again, part of the story. Because, as came up earlier, this is not simply a earthbound phenomena. That, in fact, what you have with lightning is that new studies are coming out that are trying to answer what has been an ongoing question, which is exactly, how does lightning form? We know, we can see lightning seems to come from clouds, but what actually generates the voltage which then results in a lightning strike? And this is a complete mystery up to this point. What they've been able to measure is that the voltage in a cloud is about 10 times lower than what would be required to ionize the air to create the kind of lightning strike that happens all the time. So they're trying to say, well, what could actually catalyze this process? What might be driving the actual creation, the formation of the voltage for a lightning strike. Well, what's becoming more and more evident is that, in fact, this is something which is connected to galactic and greater cosmic phenomena. That some new studies are coming out, and we're getting more and more evidence to the fact that what is driving, what is triggering these lightning strikes is cosmic radiation. Both your standard idea of what cosmic radiation is as sort of light nuclei, as well as then gamma ray radiation. That through cosmic radiation and the kind of cascading effect that's produced, you're getting, as the mechanism that they think is involved, then the creation of free electrons that are moving at near light speed, which are then moving through the clouds and are what are providing the catalyst, the spark, so to speak, to generate lightning. So that we're seeing that this lightning, connected to life, to the evolutionary process of life, is then also intimately connected to cosmic processes. That it's a galactic phenomena that we're experiencing when we experience a lightning strike. As a side note, too, many of the clouds involved, perhaps, are themselves the result of cosmic radiation. As the work of Svensmark and the recent confirmed experiments at the CERN cloud facility have shown, that cosmic radiation, in fact, could be one of the key factors in producing clouds themselves, for seeding and creating the ability for the condensing of water into clouds. So again, we see it's a cosmic process which is driving the formation of a system which itself is very intimately connected to the evolutionary process of life. Now, to take it a step further and to just see how this becomes even more and more interesting, as far as we can tell now, the main driver, creator of cosmic radiation, as well as gamma radiation, are these nebulae, these supernovae. One in particular has really captured the imagination of science and of our own movement is what's known as the Crab Nebula. We'll see an image of it here. Now, the Crab Nebula was discovered in 1054 when it was observed. You could see it's coming into this current state, was observed in China with the naked eye even during daylight hours. And it's thought that these nebulae are the real source of cosmic radiation, of that which is then feeding and seeding these clouds that produce electricity strikes, lightning strikes. Now, if we can go to the video, what I'd like to show people is, here's a time-lapse video that was put together by NASA showing the Crab Nebula in radio frequency. And what you're seeing is the pulsing character of the Crab Nebula. So this is the Crab Nebula. It's pulsing, and as it pulses, it's sending shock waves of various ranges of cosmic radiation, from gamma radiation to radio frequency, pretty much the whole spectrum. Here's the kicker, that the frequency at which the Crab Nebula is pulsing is at about 60 hertz. So here we've got the Crab Nebula pulsing at about 60 hertz. That becomes even more interesting and relevant whenever you consider the fact that 60 hertz is exactly 8 octaves of the range of the Schumann resonance. That in fact the Crab Nebula and its pulse rate is very much in tune with the harmonics of the Schumann resonances. What exactly that means, that's up for further investigation. But what we can see is that you've got this definite kind of harmonic relationship between the Crab Nebula, for example, and the standing background radiation which is there sort of hugging life here on the Earth. It takes us to then, really, what's the essence of all of this? What's the invariant behind this whole process? Is it the lightning? No, the lightning is just a singular expression of a very large and complex dynamic. But what's the one which is behind all of which we've been discussing and investigating here? It's the human mind. That the human mind is that which is able to in a sense, generate an idea of this long arc evolution of life, is able to extend its sensorium to investigate things like the Crab Nebula, is able to go beyond its simple immediate sense impressions, to generate new sense capabilities, to look deeper into the causes and nature of lightning, to bring this all together, not as a simple discovery of the truth through a new sense capability, but a discovery of what is the one which projects itself in all these many different ways. What is the one which projects itself as this evolutionary development of life? What is this one that projects itself as these various expressions of lightning? What is this one which bounds life to the cosmos? That's really the question that we have to take up. And that becomes the fundamental issue and investigation that we must take up if we're going to, in fact, master the science of physical economy. As Mr. LaRouche has said, if mankind as a species is going to move out of and survive this potential threatened extinction, it's going to be because a number of people, and more, move out of a trapped domain of the senses and into the domain of mind, to take up what is the unseen, what is the universal, which is behind all of that which we experience sensually. And so I think I'll just leave it at that. The question is on the table, and now Matt will present us with a number of questions, and we'll take them up as they come.
Okay, thank you very much, Cody. Thank you, Sky. If you're just tuning in, you're watching a live LaRouchePAC TV broadcast of a international webcast hosted by Sky Shields and Cody Jones of the LaRouchePAC Basement Science Research Team. And if you've been watching and you have questions, you can send them in right now to info.larouchepac@gmail.com. Now, we've gotten in a lot of questions, many of them coming internationally, and I'd like to start with a question from Ilya Karpovsky from Mexico City. And the subject of this question, he says, is, does solar activity equal tectonic activity? He says, greetings from Mexico. A week ago, on Saturday, December 10th, Mexico's turf shook on the scale of approximately 6.8 for 3 minutes. Though the epicenter was located along the San Andreas Fault in the state of Guerrero, which forms part of the Rim of Fire, it was also felt in Mexico City. For me, it was the first time I felt such a strong temblor. It was like standing on a light bridge when a heavy trailer passes you, shaking every part of the structure. Just in this case, everything shakes. My questions to our dear friends in the basement is on the correlation between the solar activity and seismic activity. Having watched the video on the Rim of Fire again, it stated that we should see a heightened solar activity going into its peak in 2013. This seems to have been corrected by the helioscientists. Just as Peter Martinson has reported, it shows that we are headed for a very weird solar maximum. Can you give a renewed update on the Rim of Fire based on this new evidence and new investigations? Mighty thanks, Ilya Karpovsky.
Actually, for some of the specifics on that, we're going to maybe probably pass that on to a mailbag for our weatherman to make the forecast, Peter Martinson. I mean, in general, I think what you're bringing up, though, is it's something. What you bring up in general is worth drawing out. There are clear correlations between the solar activity, seismic activity. There's a bunch of maps we've put out, and as you said, Peter himself has done a number of reports on that. But I'd like to kind of emphasize that it's the point that I mentioned before. What's significant about the Arctic development is that you really do see God has got a wonderful sense of humor with respect to us as a species, which is that sort of, it is work, that exact same impulse. Again, you picture this image of this baby being forced towards the womb. You know, no choice, it's going to cry, it'll be upset for a little bit, and it'll get over it once it's kind of out in the cold air, and after a while it'll realize that it sort of likes being out there better than it liked being in the womb. There's only going to be a handful of the actual rejects who really want to get back in later on. That'll be a small percentage. Most will enjoy it. But we've got the exact same circumstance here. I mean, it's what Pete's been doing on the weather is really significant, because take a look. Think of the relationship of early man to phenomena such as weather. And there's a reason that you get gods assigned to lightning, gods assigned to the sun, gods assigned to earthquakes, gods assigned to rivers and floods and these things. Because man, when he's in an animalistic state, views these things as completely capricious, uncontrollable. They do have the personality of these ancient gods, all-powerful, seemingly to have no consideration for the well-being of human individuals, just acting on their whim, so you get them treated as kings, etc. But then, as mankind pulls himself out of this superstitious state, you suddenly realize that these things are really only about as dangerous as they are not understood by the human species. As soon as you can start to be able to act on these things, you realize that, well, it's not actually necessary that we lose our cities every time the river floods. You can build a dam. You can decide you're going to adjust the height of the river. It's not necessary that our buildings collapse every time there's an earthquake. To begin with, you can start to construct your buildings reinforced, etc. To begin with, you can start to defend yourselves against these elements. But then the real beauty, where we're being forced out of the womb, is that as you push that track of development, at a certain point you realize, well, hell, if you've got this clear correlation and becoming more and more clear between solar activity and earthquakes, and if you look solar activity and hurricanes, meaning for those people who are new here and haven't seen a lot of Pete's work on this site, that the standard, it's starting to become more and more clear, the standard seismological explanation for earthquakes are just completely inadequate. It's not the case. The simple descriptions of activity beneath the surface of the earth, the simple mechanical ones, are not sufficient to account for what you see, the relationship between seismic activity here on Earth and then solar activity as a key example of it. To understand that, we're going to have to get a clearer and clearer picture of the way in which the sun and the interplanetary medium interact with not just the Earth, but with every single planet in the solar system. It's going to look a lot more like the study that Kepler was undertaking about the interaction between the sun and the various planetary bodies. And it's only going to be through a mastery of that we're going to be able to even begin to get the kind of serious early warning systems that we want here on the ground to deal with earthquakes and these phenomena. So it's sort of a funny situation to be in. We cannot ensure the survival of the human species on Earth without leaving the Earth. And it's just this, what it does illustrate is this need for us as a species to leave the womb. But
I'll just add a couple other things to that, and I think Pete, our weatherman, would be the first to echo this, that we also want to be careful not to just replace one mechanism with another, to where we move from, well, we once thought the mechanism was plate tectonics, the movement of plates. Now the mechanism is some sort of punch we get from the sun. Sun gets angry and knocks the Earth around a little bit. It ain't a son of a bitch. That's not the way it works. That in many of these studies, yes, we've seen correlations between certain types of activity in the sun with changes on the Earth. Volcanic activity, as well as earthquake activity, storm activity. In many cases, there's a correlation where you see a particular event, a solar flare, for example, on the sun, followed by an earthquake here on Earth. But in other cases, it's actually the inverse. You get the earthquake first, then the solar flare on the sun. So that the correlation is still there, but the time ordering is often different. That really we have to recognize the sun itself is also part of a larger system, a galactic system, an extragalactic system. So it's never any one of these things which is engaged in a simple mechanistic cause-effect kind of process, but that you have to think and go further and further to say, what's the full dynamic we're operating here? What's the overall direction of change which the process is expressing? That it's not moment-to-moment actions, where an action today is now something that exists in and of itself separate from an action tomorrow. That you have to say, what's the whole process which is involved here? I mean, for example, you've got, if we just look at the history, as we've talked about a number of times, of life on the planet over the last 500 million years, that periods which have been full, dense, with very radical terrestrial changes, earthquakes, volcanic activity, where it was at its extremes, where you would say, well, there must be something out there which is acting and creating this destructive activity here on Earth. Those same periods also are occurring at the same time that we're seeing an actual upshift, an evolutionary development. That, for example, the kinds of activity, tectonic, volcanic, other activity, which correspond with the period of wiping out the dinosaurs, which you might simply say, well, all of this activity was very destructive, that completely coincides with what really was then the rise of the higher species, of the mammals, of higher plant forms. So that if you look at the process as a whole, there are times throughout our history where what seem like cataclysmic events were also correlated to evolutionary upshifts, which then begs the question, well, what then is the larger process? What's the larger dynamic, the unseen principle which is behind this whole thing, destructive, evolutionary, and the like? So we definitely want to move into that kind of direction as we investigate these things. But yes, as we move further and further out, we will find many different kinds of triggers for these very dangerous events. But we also have to be careful that we never lock in on any one particular mechanism, say, here's the cause.
Thank you very much. I want to ask two questions together, not that they're directly related, but I think that the answers to them will both get at the same subject. The first one, ironically, is coming in from Sergei Poulinets, who viewers of this website may know as a pioneer scientist who's working in the field of earthquake precursors. And he's watching us right now from Moscow at the Fyodorov Institute for Applied Geophysics. And Mr. Poulinets says, Dear Cody and Sky, I would like to know your comments on the following. Are you feeling that the level of world leaders of the majority of countries is both very low from the side of their professional abilities and the side of their moral level? This leads to their inability to overcome the economic crisis situation, and even more with their wrong approach and the activity that they artificially create the crisis situations with increased frequency. Might it happen that civilization goes extinct because of our leaders? Now, I also want to offer this question from the United States, from the U.S. side. This is a question which came out of a meeting that was held this morning in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State between Hal Cooper, who's a consultant who has been promoting various international rail and energy development projects. Also, Sam Little, who is a former candidate for the governor of Alaska, who took third place in the former Alaskan Republican primary, and he's considering another run in the upcoming gubernatorial race. And Dave Christie also participated in this meeting, who people know is a representative from the Pacific Northwest of our federal slate of congressional candidates. And among the things that were discussed at this meeting were some of the development projects that are now going on in the Arctic, including Shell Oil's proposal to open up drilling in the Bering Sea, and the announcement from the Russian government that they just awarded the first contract to begin building the near-polar magistral line, the rail line that will run from Moscow up along the northern coast of the Russian continent and then all the way to the Bering Strait. So the question from both Hal Cooper and Sam Little is, what can we do from the United States to foster this kind of development and this kind of collaboration between the United States with both our Canadian and Russian neighbors?
I mean, there's a both of those are, I think, clearly related in the way. Look, the truth is right now, I think probably the best way to phrase where we stand is that outside of what we do right here as a political movement, outside of what Lyndon LaRouche himself personally does, and we do in association with him, we will see the extinction of the human species. I can tell you, looking at if you look at the response you have right now from the U.S. Congress, this is absurd. As I said, you can't the tenacity with which they're willing to drive themselves and everybody else underneath them in the United States towards their doom is almost amazing. It would almost be admirable if they were doing something else. If you're watching some other animal trying to trudge into, if you've watched ants trudge into some little dangerous, the burning part of a microscope or something. Yeah, they're going to do what they're going to. Their doom is sealed in the way they think about the way the universe around them works. What's missing is a fundamental conception. It's also missing from the population, though. You take a look at what can you say about a population that would vote these people into office? What can you say about a population here in the U.S. that was willing to defend Obama? If there's not a fundamental transformation, according to the conceptions that we began this discussion with, changing the identity of the human individual globally, away from the identification with the body, with sense perception, if you can't re-invoke in people the connection to arcs of history that are longer than their lifetime, the connection to cause and effect connections that are much larger than their simple familial environment or their simple neighborhood or even their simple country, if people aren't thinking on the scale that we're describing here towards galactic causes, towards huge causal arcs of history where an intention of a future state is what defines the present, if people aren't thinking in that direction, then you've got a population that's doomed. And right now, the only thing on the scene that's in a position to implement that quality of thinking and to feed that back into the population is what we have as a political movement. This also holds for the questions in the Arctic. I mean, if I didn't make it clear before, I'd like to make it clear now. Any activity in the Arctic is, say, good. Not just any old activity in the Arctic is going to keep us alive as a species. I think the character of what the Arctic could be versus what it just might simply be. The significance of Arctic development is that it is part of an arc towards our extraterrestrial imperative. If that's our actual goal, and it's clear that's our actual goal, then you're going to be able to take that Arctic development, push things far beyond where they could go. Then the Arctic development could be our margin of anti-entropy. Otherwise, it might just be some domain of limited activity. It's really important. There's a qualitative difference there depending on what you do with it. But done correctly, if there's a real vision, which is at least implicitly seems to be understood in some parts of Russia, and our goal here is to make it explicit. If you can have the explicit move towards the development of pushing the Arctic frontier as a step towards the extraterrestrial imperative frontier, and if you can have that done in collaboration with a United States freed of Obama's influence and freed of the influence of monetarism by the implementation of Glass-Steagall as a policy, if you can have those two things as prerequisites and then are engaging in a collaborative development of the Arctic with Russia from the standpoint of the extraterrestrial imperative, then you'll have the margin you need. But that's a very specific move that needs to happen. And again, the population, if this is presented to them and they're educated with it and they're given the kind of the sense of identity that's needed to act on it, they'll move with us. People will realize we're in but we are the only force that's capable of presenting that. Now, again, you can change the tide. It's funny if you take a look at what's happening right now. You want to talk about silly and idiotic world leaders, but the fact that they are not self-determined. Take a look at what's happening in the Arctic right now. I find it almost hilarious. What you've got with just the moves into the Arctic already by Russia is something you had said earlier, Matt, that looks like what Russia did with Sputnik. That by you've got even if every country in the world had no intention at all to launch any kind of a space program, the minute you say you're going to put somebody up there, you start a space race, and you change the conditions. You're forcing that baseline up. If anybody's going to survive, they're going to have to move with you by the fact that you're making that motion. You're changing the geometry in which people operate. You take a look at that animation we had before of this changing map of the world. I hate to pull it, but you take an image of what it looks like. Oh, we can pull it up. That you get, the map is a certain image. You're getting a certain sense of you're getting a certain transformation there. But if you really think topologically about the space in which human and economic activity really takes place, there's a real space in which that activity takes place. Everything you see around you on the globe, etc., is simply a projection of that real space that exists somewhere else. If you take a look, certain types of activity that people do that are simply, we called before, there's certain activity you can take which is like an ant walking along that surface. And that ant is what that ant thinks is a straight line, what that ant thinks is a short distance, is defined by the internal characteristics of that surface. There is another kind of action that you can take on that surface, which is to change the characteristic curvature of that surface, where you, as a willful act, are going to change the possible interrelations there, and you're going to change what all those little ants think are straight lines. That's what we're in a position to do right now. That's the real unit of economic action, that kind of a topological transformation. We are in a position to do that, but only us as a movement are in a position to do that. And what we do over these next few weeks is going to determine that. Whether we can stop a drive for nuclear war. And again, the actions that LaRouche has taken in the recent weeks has moved us in the direction to potentially be able to do that. It may not be enough. We're going to have to do a lot more. And people should be anybody who's watching this, even for the first time, should be involved in our fight and our campaign to stave that off. But then to help us in the broader arc, because as long as Obama remains in office, the threat of nuclear war, of a thermonuclear war, is a very real one. As long as Obama remains in office, it will be impossible for us to implement the necessary policies such as Glass-Steagall, etc. So we've got a clear series of steps that need to be launched. Looking at Congress, however, the only people in the world who've got the courage to push that through are us and our association with Lyndon LaRouche. So again, I'd like to invert it, that for both of them, there is the Arctic development policy would be our only way out right now, but it has to be done in the context of this longer arc and in the specific context we're talking about here with the dumping of Obama and the reestablishment of a credit system through Glass-Steagall. But the only people on the scene to launch that are us. So we will see the extinction of the human species if we don't do our job adequately.
I just want to amplify an element of what was brought up by Sky, that it's important to recognize that your morality is wholly a function of your sense of identity. If your sense of identity is rooted in your immediate sense impressions, well, then your morality is going to be a function of a very degraded sense of those impressions. And this, in fact, has been really what's at the heart of the oligarchical principle, that the oligarchy has done everything in their ability to, in effect, trap people in their senses, to where their sense of identity is their immediate sense impressions. You see this in the way it's expressed in the kind of science which is promoted by the oligarchical tradition. For example, what you have with the second law of thermodynamics, where you arbitrarily try to extrapolate a universe based off a very simple sense-based model of kinetic interactions of gases, for example, and then say based off of a simple impression of how these little molecules will interact with each other, we can then say, well, the whole universe operates in this way. That ultimately the universe will reach this point of what's called as heat death, where all of the available heat, all of the available energy in the universe will eventually run out, and when it's all said and done, the universe will end in this very fixed, dead, static state. From that standpoint, once you accept that idea, you've accepted that fundamentally what bounds the universe, what's the boundary of the universe in which you exist, is a fixedness. That the universe is bound by an inevitable fixed state. Which then means that within that, what you do today, what you do tomorrow, really, what's the relevance? As I said before, if you see a little old lady crossing the street and you decide to help her across the street or rob her for her purse, in the end, what does it really matter? Because in the end, the final state is going to be this cold heat death, and everything that happens in between is somewhat arbitrary and just up to personal taste. And so the oligarchy has always acted in a way to trap people's sense of identity into an idea of the biological trapping of the senses. Because once you accept that, then the kind of science and the derived notion about the nature of the universe and the world you lived in is going to have that quality. It's going to have a quality of fixedness, like we see in the attempt to reduce all material in the universe down to some fundamental hard ball, a fundamentally hard, unchanging, microscopic ball. That's what builds up everything in the universe. Or the idea of entropy, as I just said. So the oligarchical principle has always been towards giving and implanting in people the idea that the universe is fundamentally fixed, unchanging, not creative, and really is only accessible to you through your senses. And once you accept that, then you start to accept all of the economic dogma of Adam Smith and others. You know, the bestial notions of things. That we can't really change anything, we can't really know anything. All we can have is our immediate experiences, our lusts, our pleasures, our fears. And so if you want to get at the idea of morality, or the lack thereof in our leaders, it really lies in this conception of what is the state of identity of our population, and what's the state of identity promoted by our current culture. You go after that, you change that. You start to move people away from a trapped sense of identity in the senses towards one of the mind, towards creativity. Now you're on a path towards having a society and its leaders reflecting a real morality, which itself is a reflection of a real sense of identity, which is of a immortality. So I would just add that, and yeah, we can move on.
Well, I think on this subject of the discussion of the leadership of the United States and who in the United States represents the natural allies of the leadership of Russia, for example, there was a very significant blog posting on the LaRouche PAC website posted yesterday by Bill Roberts, who's one of the members of the LaRouche Federal Slate for Congress. And he was responding directly to something that Prime Minister Vladimir Putin said in his recent webcast, which occurred, I think, this Wednesday, that we would love to have allies inside the United States. And I think Bill Roberts was speaking for the entirety of the LaRouche federal slate of candidates and the LaRouche PAC by saying the alliance is here. We're here. We're saying we're going to remove Obama from office by constitutional means, and we have the power, at least intellectually and morally, to lead this country and to bring us back to what we are intended to be. Now, on that note, we also have a few questions that have come in from other members of the LaRouche federal slate, one from Keisha Rogers, one from Diane Sayer, one from Summer Shields. I'd like to read Summer Shields' question. I think it would be an interesting place to bring this up. He says, this is a question on the Schumann resonance and political impact. My question takes up the nature of Schumann resonance and human psychic communication, perhaps, for the lack of a better term, and political organizing. If we know that mankind as a whole developed biologically under a very specific electromagnetic frequency bandwidth, then is there something more to this concept of prescience or intuition? If it is the case that what we call that tip of your tongue feeling associated with creative discovery, is this a universal process connected to electromagnetism? And then what does that say about human morality? What I mean to say is, in the discussion taken up in the weekly report on the LaRouche PAC website last Wednesday, the entropic closed system was related to invisible forces that inhibit your emotional inclination to break with tradition. Since we know that there are clear cases of mass phenomena associated with populations, especially during times of political and economic upheaval, as we are experiencing today, then how can we best resonate with the population and get them to do the good? I am saying this fully aware that at many times in the political ebbs and flows of the U.S. population in particular, you start to get that same refrain being expressed from them. Quite common today, for instance, how are we going to get Obama out, and who are we going to replace him with? While these are seemingly simple questions, I think that something much deeper lies behind these questions. But how do we use these concepts of an upward evolution, closely connected to cosmic radiation, to best organize a population that is clearly experiencing a mass phenomenon at this very given moment?
I would just start by saying that in looking at the Schumann resonance phenomena, that we have to see it first primarily as really an extension of our sense capability. That I specifically wanted to make the point that there is maybe information which is transmitted over long distances, which is used to correlate and coordinate coherent effects among biological organisms. But just as a book that's before me, if I have no mind and no ability to read, all of that information is worthless. So, first we have to figure out how do you, in fact, in a sense, tap into, through an extension of our sense capabilities, into these various aspects of cosmic radiation, whether it's Schumann resonance, whether it's aspects of cosmic radiation from the Crab Nebula. We have to first understand what are the principles involved, which will then inform the development of certain types of instrumentation, certain types of extended senses, which will allow us to tune into that information, so to speak. But just having the information, just having the data, does not mean that then we have an idea. There's something higher that's behind that, the mind. The mind is really what has to become primary. So you want to extend the capabilities of the substrate, so to speak, upon which the mind will act. But we can never confuse the substrate and the extension of the senses with the process which one produced the extended sensorium through a discovery of principle, nor confuse that with the mind, which then must necessarily be present to make sense, so to speak, of those sense impressions, to be able to understand what's the one which is generating this new sequence of change as reflected in something like cosmic radiation. What must be the principle that would project itself in this particular kind of way? So whenever we start to get into the domain of political organizing, it has to operate in the domain of mind. As you start to act on the mind of the population through the presentation of paradox, by a provoking of the holes that are in their sense impressions, that in doing that you can start to tap into a higher quality of resonance, a resonance that might exist in what Vernadsky would term the noosphere. How do you tap into a certain resonant quality of the noosphere, which itself involves something which is not simply just a immediate time-based phenomena, but which encompasses things like history. You can never, when you're dealing with the domain of mind and human noetic processes, the role of history. That at every moment, the entirety of history is operating. That at every moment, a quality of the future is operating. And it's in that domain that we have to figure out how do you act there? How do you start to change the curvature of the culture there? Now, doing that and having an enhanced ability to do that may mean understanding more and more these cosmic radiant phenomena as a generalized concept. But we can never confuse the effect, even as wild and revolutionary as the effect is, we can never confuse that with the actual mind itself, with the process of the noetic. So that's just how I would initially say that's the way we have to start to undertake the investigation, and we have to be very clear about that differentiation. That yes, there may be certain cosmic effects, or what we would call radiant effects, which operate on a kind of coherent global scale that may produce some kind of what we might call mass effects in the population. But the mechanism or the medium through which that acts is itself not the principle which creates the act, is not the mind that creates the mass effect. So I think part of the discussion has to go in understanding that differentiation and then really figuring out how do you tune into actually operating from the domain of mind. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if Sky has...
There's a couple. I mean, do these work too? These do, yep. I'm just on it. It seems on those, some of the best, on this point, some of the best people to look at are the poets. So poets who've taken part in political activity. Because they've got two. On this, one that Lyndon LaRouche, Lynn's referenced a lot is Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Right.
And his sense of, well, what are these processes? There's clearly something else there. If you're realizing that there is no such thing as an isolated human mind.
Right.
There's only mind as part of as really an encapsulating part of the broader universe. That somehow the whole universe exists in such a way that it is a perfect reflection and is contained, in a sense, by every single human mind individually.
Right.
It gives you a very difficult topology to describe. And in fact, if you look at, that's the way Vernadsky describes his noosphere. And in description of his noosphere, and he makes the point, it's never possible to separate an individual human mind from the noosphere. That there's not, the two things are twice. It's not something that sits inside of the noosphere and can be taken out. It's an integral part of it. And he cites Shelley in that connection. He realizes that Shelley represents that Shelley realizes that there's a whole other medium, that the means for human individual to act on human individual is not from the outside,
right,
but it's by steering the process. But sort of the paradox that I think is described in the question is best described by another poet who was, the poet of revolution in Germany, Friedrich Schiller. Because he, in the beginning of his ascetical letters, he opens up with a paradox that I love, the way he situates it. He says, well, look, you've got a fundamental paradox in the population, which is that if you think of all the activity that could make you wise, that could ever make you, think about the kinds of experiences that would make you a better person. Think about the kinds of education, the kinds of challenges you're going to put yourself through. Every single one of those is something that, from the standpoint of sense perception, seems horrible.
Yeah.
Everything in your sense perception tells you that you want to avoid these kinds of painful experiences, other things. So he says, well, this is a problem. That means that, but those are the only experiences that would teach you not to depend on sense perception. That can make you wise. So you've got a problem, you've got a fundamental paradox, which means that the only people who could ever become wise are the only people who would pursue these experiences, who would have to be people who are already wise. So anybody who was already wise would get wiser and wiser and wiser by pursuing these experiences. And anybody who was already not wise, just could only be moved by sense perception, would get dumber and dumber and dumber and become more and more depraved. So he says, well, that seems terrible. That's not, how do you manage society if that's the case? And he says, well, that's the role of classical culture and classical art.
Right.
Is that it is possible to take a population, take children, take infants, who've got no sense of what it means, what a discovery of truth is, and you can give them the intuitive sense of, you can use the classical composition to teach them to love that drive towards irony, that drive towards paradox, that drive towards contradiction, always breaking out of the confines of tradition, the system you find yourselves in, to move to the newer one. And he describes you can what he describes as being able to teach. Now, if you look at another one of the English language poets who writes about the same kind of phenomenon, Keats, people know from at the end of his Ode to Grecian Urn, where he just makes the statement that the urn says to man that beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. But then as he develops that idea elsewhere as this exact same point, is saying, okay, well look, what is the instinct that allows you to leave any fixed system? He says logic will not work. Deductive logic will only teach you how to navigate a system.
Yeah.
Using deductive logic, you're like that ant that walks around the surface. But if you can use the instinct for beauty, and I think his definition of beauty is exactly the same as Schiller, who has a perfectly rigorous description of it.
Mm-hmm.
The instinct for beauty, properly understood, can lead you to truth through irony, through metaphor. You're able to come up with these structures that move you outside of any given fixed system. And so that's in that you really are. I mean, the effect of that is something you would want to, that is on the level of what people would want to call psychic, etc., whatnot. Yeah. It's an effect that's far beyond anything that it transcends the medium that you're using to try and have that effect.
Right.
And I think it gives a reason why you get the ability that in that, connected to that process is all the kinds of intuition that you get with great leaders. Certain kinds of bellwethers have the ability to have an intuition about where we stand, the direction in which things will move, and what are the necessary steps that must be taken to move us. And it has to be that form because there's no way to simply deduce it from the existing state of the system.
Right. I think that's where you get these, what seem like mass provocations, where you're getting, maybe it's not occurring in what we typically think of as a simple point-to-point interaction, but something about the overall boundary condition state of the system is starting to change. Mm-hmm. That's going to create a certain kind of resonance in the population, on the planet, what have you, because the boundary condition is changing. Mm-hmm. And you start to get a kind of mass sensing. Maybe you're not sensing it in the most immediate way. You're not seeing something specific that everyone's seeing the same thing or hearing the same thing. Mm-hmm. But in another way, you're sensing a shift in the boundary condition of the process. Mm-hmm. So you're getting a kind of mass provocation. Mm-hmm. The provocation doesn't necessarily lead to the solution, but the provocation, in a certain way, like you get in classical culture, the provocation is what kind of piques the interest, in a sense, puts you in a place where you're ready to find mm-hmm. something new. The question is now there. Right. If the question's not there, you're never going to come to any higher idea. You have to be provoked. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of what we're trying to look at is how do these kinds of mass provocations occur? How do we understand a real shift in the overall boundary condition of the process, which somehow then resonates and radiates through the population? And really being, so I think Lynn is really good at being tuned into those shifts, mm-hmm. such that as the resonating process is going on, he's there to jump in and be like, here's what we do. Right. And in a sense, he's responding to a question that is in your mind, but you're not even fully aware of what the question is. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's something we ourselves have to really start to master and become, be able to wield that ability.
We've got a good arsenal with which to do it. I mean, it's real. People, think about the response. Think about the United States underneath the Apollo program, not the god Apollo, but the actual our mission to land a man on the moon, several on the moon. And if you think about that, there's something. You get Shelley's Spirit of an Age. You can grip a population mm-hmm. by a sense that's much higher.
Right.
If you ask them individually what the hell was going on, they wouldn't know. You ask people individually, they're excited by great projects. They're excited by all the elements that a human being should be excited by.
Right.
It seems like the art now is to introduce this, but then can you get a degree of self-conscious awareness of what exactly it is that they're responding to?
Right.
You're human, so the part that makes you, as we said before, is much bigger than your body. It's you. It's sort of, you got limbs that are all extended throughout space and time in a different way than your physical body is. But now, you'll respond to things that happen in that domain. But how do you get people to become aware that that actually is them and to self-identify with that? That's the trick. That's the cultural problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't think coincidentally there are a lot of questions coming in on precisely this subject. since, as you posed in the very beginning, Sky, at a time of history like this, it's very impossible to begin dealing with the level of questions that are necessary for us to take up if you don't begin by examining your own sense of human identity. Now, there are two questions from other members of the federal candidates slate actually on this subject. I'd like to read these. Maybe they can be discussed further in other discussions on this website, but I think it's just important to put these questions into the mix here. Diane Sayer says, "It seems to me that written language is one significant indicator of a human identity beyond sense perception. That is, you could describe the various curly shapes of the letters and the contrast between the ink and the paper, but if you know the language that you are reading, the scribbles leap into formation of ideas in your mind. This occurs even if the author of the words has been long since dead. What is the relationship between language, written and spoken, and human creativity and identity? Isn't destruction of language a way of bestializing man?" Now, Keisha Rogers, who's a member of the candidate slate from Houston, Texas, and she has filed her candidacy as a Democrat for Congress in the Houston area. She says, "Hello, this is Keisha Rogers, LaRouche Democrat in Texas 22. My question is, Mr. LaRouche has recently been discussing the concept of metaphor as non-deductive relations. He has also described metaphor as a physical principle in the universe as real as gravitation and representing something outside of the senses. I have a two-part question. First, what must be the essential understanding of metaphor in economic forecasting? And how does the contradiction in sense perception readings indicate physical boundary conditions in an economic process?" I'd actually like to see if you guys have any input on those questions.
I mean, there's a couple. Again, to go back to the cases that we had on the Arctic as a study, I think it's important to realize what is so amazing about the concept of potential relative population density, energy flux density, the actual calculation of these things. If you were going to actually try and come up with a determination of these as quantities, the domain in which they exist is in the domain of mind and principle. I mean, you can take if you were to take every other physical economic indicator presently, it would be, and keep them exactly the same in two possible states. One, in the state in which you've got a collapsing culture, and another in the case in which you've got a developing culture. The tangent at that point might seem to be exactly the same. You'd say, okay, well, that state as defined will seem to be exactly the same, but the question of whether it's in a decline or a collapse lies in this domain of mind, most fundamentally. In both, you could even see temporary growth. In the two, you could see what looked like temporary contemporary growth. I mean, if we can we pull up the sort of image number 3? Number 3. Oh, great. Oh, sorry. 3, 4, 5. There we go. And pause it here. Now, this, you see, I sort of want to give as an image that's characteristic of oligarchical policy in general, imperial policy in general, but also the characteristic of a closed system. You could apply this curve to resource consumption, technological development, anything. That the characteristic of an empire is that it follows a fixed, closed set of rules. We've discussed things like the Code of Diocletian as case studies of it. But the same thing, the existing code of liberalism is exactly that. You've got a few set fixed rules that you must obey. Any kind of innovation, pursuit of truth, though this is not allowed, that gives you a closed system whose structure ontologically is no different than a closed logical system, like the sort of heat engines that Sadi Carnot studied. Which means that you've got entropy is these systems now are subject to entropic development. So you'll see a period of apparent growth as it's consuming whatever the existing resource base. It's consuming the consumable goods that are defined by that closed state of the system. You'll see growth, and you'll see that growth eventually taper off into a collapse. Now, there's ways to hide that. For instance, a current imperial policy we have right now globally, as the system collapses, it moves to new areas of looting. So if you can stave off the appearance of a collapse inside the United States by suddenly destroying labor laws, moving abroad, and then destroying populations abroad using globalization and free trade. That is, a collapse is still equally a collapse as it was before, but now you're draining like a vampire. You're sucking the blood of populations globally in order to try and feed the thing. Then you want to try and keep the appearances of a collapse internally as that becomes looted, and you start shifting to finding other areas of the physical economy to loot and localize it. So you build these financial bubbles, you loot the housing market. Then, to keep that from blowing, you decide to loot the houses from the actual population once you've looted the market. So you launch this whole wave of foreclosures. But it's a closed system that's in decline. That will always be the characteristic of a closed system of an empire. But now, if we can play the rest of this. But now, if in the middle of that development, that period, the first period of consumption, the initial period of consumption, you've got the investment, pause it, into something else. You've got the focus. You're driving for where that system breaks, and you're launching yourself into new areas of development. You're saying, well, I have a population that loves the concept of irony, that loves metaphor, that loves the idea that I'm going to find out where this system falls apart and push for the further breakthroughs. The essence of human creativity is driving towards irony as a physical concept. You have that. Then that same tangent, that same initial tangent to your process at that, what was a path towards collapse in the closed imperial system, is instead now a series of developments through subsequent states of the system, higher and higher levels of each higher and higher hypotheses, where the overall arc is what we find discussed. Lynn discusses as evident in Plato as that hypothesis of the higher hypothesis, which gives you a continuous sequence of discontinuities. So the ability to have that, this is not something that you'll find in any physical measure of the system.
Right.
That exists in mind. That does exist in this domain of metaphor, and you find it in expressions of culture such as language, etc.
Yeah, we often use the famous aphorism from Heraclitus, "Nothing is constant but change." Now that should not be understood as a simple idea of change in nothing's constant but a change of position or something.
Not Obama's change.
Right, it's not that change. It's not change instead of a dollar or something.
Right.
But change in the sense that things are always in the process of creative development. That if the universe is inherently creative, it's never going to express itself in any way other than that which is the substance of metaphor. Because where does metaphor come up? It comes up as, say, for a poet who has an idea, a higher conception about the nature of man, the universe, what have you. But it's not a conception which has any literal means of communication. It's an idea about a principle, a quality of change. You have an idea about what's the quality of change which is human. You can't communicate that in some simple, deductive way. You can only communicate it through a kind of provocation, by taking what's available in your language, what's available in the impressions of the population, and juxtaposing them, presenting them in such a way that the audience is led to see that, well, nothing in literally what's being said really is solid. There's something shaky about the way you're using this language, and you're provoking them, but in the same way it's also lawful. You have a sense that though it's shaky and not solid, there's something lawful about it. So you're moving to provoke the population to say, well, what must be in that poet's mind which would generate this particular juxtaposition, this particular counterpoint of imagery, of sounds, what have you. And because that's how the universe works. The universe is never just an extrapolation from the previous state. If it's always moving into a state of change, if it's creative, where new states are always coming about, the new state of the universe could never express itself in terms of its previous state. So it's always going to express itself as irony. The universe that's why we say the universe in substance is irony, because the universe is always expressing itself in a way which is creatively different than any previous state. And that's going to be the substance of both the universe and the creative human mind.
Right. And it properly understood. See, Gödel's famous proof, properly understood, is a shadow of that principle.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Right.
fact, and it does tell you something about the inability, the inapplicability of logical deduction to the kind of process that you're describing.
Right.
We've got many questions that are continuing to come in. I want to jump over to Japan for a minute. We've got a question from Haruka Saito, who's in Japan right now. She says, "Hello, I'm Haruka Saito. I'm an agriculturalist and a soil scientist here in Japan, and I'd like to submit a question regarding agriculture and the biosphere." And she gives a very interesting description of what's happening in terms of a fight inside Japan over soil science and agricultural science generally, with many people using fertilizers, pesticides, and so forth, but some people who are coming in to try to say, look, we need to not only solve problems at the very point of the problem, pesticides, fertilizers, and so forth, those are good, but we need to also understand how soil science and agriculture is part of a much bigger system. And she gives an interesting description about a pioneer study that she's a part of, saying that a dozen or so farmers that she's working with are adopting this approach of looking at the higher laws of the ecosystem and applying this to their farming methods. And she makes a very strong point that this is not merely sustainable eco-farming or something. So she says, soon I will start up a project here in Japan to prove the Vernatskian law of life, that energy is condensed in the field of life, in the biosphere as a whole, where man's creative power has a major role to play. As a part of that effort, I am taking up an initiative to translate Vernadsky's writings into Japanese for the very first time in history.
Right. God bless you.
But for these new approaches to succeed in any part of the world, I think that there are a lot of questions that must first be answered. On this occasion, I would like to ask the basement team the following two questions that my associates and I are being challenged with. Firstly, how can we enhance the overall energy flow or energy flux density in the biosphere as a whole? And what would be a measurement of energy flux density of the whole? Secondly, to make agriculture more creative or productive, what kind of agricultural or social policy should be enacted? Thank you very much for your work. I'll be looking for your answer. Haruka Saito.
I mean, a short thing, you have more to say, is that I think one thing for certain is that with the introduction of the human species as a manifest phenomenon, you have cognition always implicit. Mm-hmm. So you say, we've asked the question before, where was cognition before you had human beings? It's implicit, you get it there. With the introduction of human beings, frankly, human beings are the best measure of the energy throughput of the entire biosphere. That same measure of potential relative population density is the best measure for the overall productivity of the biosphere. Is the biosphere allowing for the maintenance of more and more human beings at higher and higher standards of living and at higher and higher productivity, individual productivity for those human beings? That's a productive biosphere. That'll always measure your increase. The effectiveness of agricultural techniques will be measured by that. The effectiveness of anything else that's happening in the biosphere is measured by that.
Yeah, I think it's what we've seen reflected in the evolution of life itself as a whole, say prior to man's introduction into the biosphere, that we see an evolution of species, each species itself representing, say, as you move from, as we've discussed, from reptile to mammal, that the mammalian form has a higher throughput of material, biogenic flow of material, as Vernadsky would put it. It's more energetic. It can survive in more diverse types of climates. It can act year-round, whereas, say, reptiles under certain conditions have to hibernate, have to, hide during cold weather. Snakes do. The amount of activity they're engaged in is much lower. So you see in the evolution from one species to the next, what you would measure as a kind of energy throughput in the evolution of the species. But that also reflects what's happened to the entire biosphere. It's not as if the biosphere itself stayed static and it's just these species within it which are changing. The whole system has changed, right? You've developed new forms of, like we've talked about, the advancement from gymnosperms to angiosperms, where now the available plant life was more energy dense. You had moves over the long term of change of climates. Climate has become more diverse over time.
Right.
You get new kinds of species and new types of organisms being introduced into the biosphere. So the entire biosphere is going through a full upshift. That's then reflected at the species level in the evolution towards higher species, which themselves reflect a higher energy flux density. From that standpoint, we then go to human beings and say, well, where do we see something like that in humanity? Well, we don't evolve in that simple way, in the sense of growing new limbs or becoming biologically fundamentally different. Our evolution is expressed in terms of cultural and scientific evolution, that the introduction of a new idea, a new principle, whether scientific or cultural principle, represents that kind of upshift, represents our ability to do more work more efficiently, to, as we saw with the discussion on the Arctic, to survive in more extreme climates, to get off of the planet. So yes, as you're saying, the measure ultimately of a total upshift of the biosphere as a whole is going to be reflected in man's increased ability to do more creative work, in the creative output of mankind as a whole. As you would see with NWAPA. NWAPA and what it would mean for mankind also reflects what would be an overall upshift in the biosphere in terms of changing weather systems, the water cycle, etc.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. You have to, at this point, to measure the biosphere, you necessarily must measure man.
Right. You don't want any isolated measure. So what you said with the reptiles versus mammals, it's funny, if you were to try to measure it based on energy efficiency, we've done, Ben Dennison has a video on the site doing that. If you try to measure them using energy efficiency or waste production,
right,
the argument you would get is, well, reptiles are more efficient than mammals, because what is a reptile does, a reptile is sort of like Newt Gingrich, where, Newt Gingrich says you never spend $1 you don't own.
Right.
Reptiles don't. Reptiles will never use any energy they do not own at that moment. If the sun is warm, they walk. If it goes cold, they stop.
Right.
So a reptile is exactly, it's like Newt Gingrich, and then oddly enough, this is where I think you find the actual familial relationship between Newt Gingrich and the environmentalists, because environmentalists make the same argument, right? You only use the energy we have. You live within our means. If they manage the biosphere, if Newt Gingrich or environmentalists manage the biosphere, we never would have gotten past reptiles,
right?
Because mammals produce more waste, and put it in quotes. Mammals produce more. They seem to be less efficient at using certain things internally, because they're playing a bigger role in maintaining the biosphere as a whole.
Right.
Moving to new territory by being, pigs, literally, for at least some of them. Some of the mammals are literally pigs, but using pigs as far as using the energy, increasing the throughput, consuming more, using all of that to maintain a very high internal body temperature. I mean, how decadent is that? You're going to keep yourself warm all the time, even when it's cold outside?
Right.
Isn't that like just using your thermostat at the wrong time? They do it. As a result of doing that, you maintain the development of the biosphere as a whole. That's your only measure. If you come to anything smaller, you're going to end up with something that's just wrong. The same thing with measuring energy sources. People try to do the simple energy efficiency measurement of the solar panel or something like that. The place where the solar panel will destroy society is not within the solar panel. The solar panel destroys society everywhere else.
The thing is, where the solar panel is most effective is actually where it's most destructive. Because they're most effective in a desert.
Right.
But if you cover the desert in solar panels, you're never going to green that desert.
Yes.
So it's actually funny. It has the relationship of where solar panels are most effective, their overall effect is most destructive.
That gives you, so that's the oligarchical principle right there. It's a perfect agreement with it. If it's successful, it will destroy itself and everything else with it.
And lends credence to the idea that the oligarchy may be reptilians.
Yeah, possibly. These distant cousins.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. We have a question from a professor of nuclear and space sciences, but he's a former NASA principal investigator for the Apollo lunar samples. And he's somebody who's been in correspondence with members of our basement team. And I think it's just important because we have to remember we're holding this webcast under very dangerous circumstances when you have not only a move for dictatorship and police state inside the United States, but this is something which the entire transatlantic system is experiencing now. And he asks about the relationship between this kind of move towards police state and the green fascism. He says, if present policies of world leaders concerning global climate change are supposedly intended to benefit society, then why are climate scientists who manipulated global temperature data continuing to receive public tax funds to promote the global climate warming story? While the concerned citizens who released the emails that documented data manipulation are having their computers seized in midnight raids through coordinated action of the UK Metropolitan Police, Norfolk Constabulary Computer Crime Division, and the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division.
I mean, I think this gets at the heart of why we've said that really, in essence, environmentalism is population reduction. That's the intention. I mean, you have to look no further than just the statement, the absurd statement that seems so ridiculous, but it was made by Prince Philip, one of the people at the heart of the environmentalist movement, who said if he could be reincarnated, he would like to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to help solve the problem of overpopulation. That's the mentality of an environmentalist. Now, it has nothing to do with preserving the environment either. It has to do with preserving the power of the oligarchical system. Because there is a recognition that in order to do what we're talking about, to move towards, from say, nuclear to fusion power, etc., that one, that's required in order to support more population. So to have more population at higher standards of living, you necessarily have to keep going towards this increase in energy flux density. To achieve this increase in energy flux density means you have to have an ever increasingly educated population. More and more people have to be engaged in productive activity, have to have a better grounding in classical culture. As we said, some of the forefront breakthroughs that are to come in atomic physics are going to come from people who think in this classical mode. So in order to continue to increase energy flux density to support a larger population means more and more of your population is going to have to break free from this trappings of the senses, the simple bestial-based sense of identity. More and more of a population moving in that direction is a population which is not going to submit to an oligarchy. Is not a population which is going to just roll over and play dead whenever Obama and his people want to push this new fascist police state bill, this military budgeting appropriations bill. So inherently the oligarchy recognizes that population increase and technological increase go hand in hand, and that at the core of that is an increased higher sense of identity on the part of man. And that a population with that identity is not controllable, is not manipulable by this oligarchical class. And so they hate anything that reeks of that real human identity.
Right.
And environmentalism really is that. It's an attempt through sophistry to crush the human impulse in the population.
And that's all they care about. It's not, like you said, they don't care about the development of maintaining the environment, because what the hell does that mean? You can't maintain the environment. The environment doesn't maintain the environment. But the whole history of the biosphere has been evolving, changing again in ways that they would dislike. Again, always increasing energy consumption. There's never a case where the biosphere moves towards decreased energy consumption. It moves towards increased energy consumption at the same time as it moves towards increased density, energy flux density of energy usage. Those happen at the exact same time. That's where it wants to move to. We do that more efficiently than anything else. You said the drive for these guys is only to try and stop that sort of progress.
Yeah.
That's all they care about.
Yeah.
All they care about is stopping human development, and they'll pick any argument they can to do it. So it's not a coincidence that you get this weird idolizing of animal species. You get the weird that why they love these nature channels. Without the fact that, first off, the only reason those animal species are there to be seen is because of us. The only reason that they're edited, the actual, you see the sort of the loving, the nice kind of the cute fuzzy pictures of polar bears. It takes a lot of effort to get a cute fuzzy picture of a polar bear. Mm-hmm. Not most of the polar bear's lifetime is not spent being fuzzy and cute. And watch, they did this recent documentary on the mating habits of polar bears. Never seen anything more wild and disgusting. First, the behavior, but I mean, really just foul. The thing that struck me the most is female polar bears, once they've had their cubs, will not mate. They won't mate because they've got this sense they need to take care of the cubs. But male polar bears want to mate. So the way the male polar bear will get the female polar bear in the mood is to show up and then eat her children. And then once he's eaten her children, she gets back in the mood again, and they can go on and produce. And this is your cute fuzzy polar bear. This is what's on your stupid looking Coke can now.
Right.
This stupid little white Coke can. So anyhow, yeah, there's no consistency in the argument there. There's not meant to be any consistency. It's just the real thing is that they hate human beings, and they'll grab onto anything they possibly can to try and make that argument that what human beings do is bad.
Right. That's the real bare naked environment.
Exactly right, yeah.
Well, on the subject of your new sport, Sky, feeding penguins to polar bears, this is a question from Argentina on Antarctic development. This is from Rosina Castillo. She says, in this recent time, President Cristina Kirchner has started developing a concept which she termed fine-tuning, and she is developing it further as time goes on. So far, she has tried to convey that this is the new face of the recovery of Argentina, and that now we are not talking about the industrialization of the country or just having more development, but to integrate the whole region, logistically, with transport, energy supply lines, and make a huge development corridor for being more efficient, as she put it. We are seeing this as a good opportunity to turn this fine-tuning idea in the developing of the extended NWAPA concept for South America, maybe SOWAPA. And we are thinking about developing this discussion with the political and scientific circles through our website and in collaboration with the basement. We see this as a real good opportunity also to overcome the war efforts, which the British are always trying to make to destroy all cooperation in the world. Because this obviously will involve the development of more cooperation among South American countries, as was stated in the last meeting of UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. They are applying about 30 new infrastructure projects integrating different countries. So the prospect is really good if we can get out of the war threat. But the question here is about the Antarctic region. As you know, being in the south, this makes us closer to the Antarctic. The question for us now is what would be the role of the Antarctic region given the different conditions with respect to the Arctic? Can we look at this region like what Alaska is for the NWAPA system? Are the changes in the Arctic going to be directly affecting also the Antarctic?
I mean, there's a couple of, obviously, whatever techniques are developed for the colonization of the Arctic are applicable to the colonization of Antarctica. And that'll be interesting. You open up a whole new territory there, obviously, and then you can make some of the research stations there a little more comfortable, because there's an amazing amount of research to be being done and to be done in Antarctica.
Yeah.
Most of it having nothing to do with all the environmentalist labels they have to put on it. But I think the exciting one for me to figure out is going to be, I don't know, do people realize how recently it was that Antarctica became covered in ice? But there's numerous fossils on Antarctica, fossil life there. And
its ice is growing now. Wow.
Right,
Arctic
yeah.
ice is shrinking.
But this is recent. It's in like the tens of millions of years ago. It was not Antarctica migrated down to the pole, southern pole, sat there for a long time, temperate, dinosaurs, little tiny fuzzy mammals. I'm sorry, temperate, not the dinosaurs, fuzzy mammals, different life. There is with an active environment there for a while at the pole before any ice appeared at all. And two things I'd like to know is A, what the heck happened? There's still debates on that, and of course they're trying to attribute it to carbon dioxide. But as we're seeing with some of the Arctic icing, Arctic ice melting, and the Antarctic ice, as you're saying, expanding, we're realizing there's no simple relationship to temperature for the reason that the ice is there.
Right.
That we get to discover. It might cause a real dilemma, though, for all the environmentalists who are trying to keep the Earth in its static system for the sake of the animal life, because the question becomes, which animal life do you defend?
Right.
Who's got more dibs on the thing, the animal life right now or the animal life that was living in Antarctica? What happened to them when the ice spread?
Right.
And maybe we should give them back their territory, have the little reconquista of Antarctica for the little fuzzy things that used to live there.
Right. Well, the other thing I think that'll really piss the oligarchy off is that the natural collaborator for Argentina in that region is South Africa. That those are the two tips that are most accessible to that region. And as far as I understand, there's been some minimal collaboration. But if you look at South Africa, for example, they currently have the largest radio array telescope. I'm not sure if it's in just for the southern hemisphere or for the world, but they currently have that. And they're now in a kind of a bidding war with a grouping that wants to set this up in Australia. But they're in a bidding war to build then in South Africa the largest, what would be by orders of magnitude, the largest radio telescope ever built. And they're thinking of it in terms of this kind of leapfrogging process, that just jump ahead of the pack through this. So you get those two nations, those two continents, now collaborating in the Antarctic region. And you have a potential to just blow this thing wide open. Plus the fact that it's unique. We don't get a whole lot of... There's not a whole lot going on. We're looking at that side of our galaxy. Right. I mean, most of all our telescopes and things that are ground-based, we're always looking up in the northern hemisphere. There's a whole other half of the universe down there, so to speak. And so it is key that we get more and more collaboration among those nations and then around the Antarctic development so that we can open up a whole new view of our world.
Okay, coming back to some of the questions that you raised specifically, Sky, in your opening presentation. These are two questions that come out of a graduate working group at Stanford University who, as people may or may not know, have been actively engaged over a span of several months, over a year, in studying and debating Lyndon LaRouche's ideas of physical economics. The first question is this. We were very struck by LaRouche's discussion of the difference between the human brain and the human mind. It would seem simple enough, but the implications are enormous. It has resolved many of our debates, but given rise to more than a few others. Clearly, it is the quality of mind that differentiates the human species from others, and it is this that makes man uniquely creative. Now, would you agree that the universe is also creative? Can you talk a little bit about how you would qualify that? And finally, could one say that the universe itself is or has a mind? And second question from the same group. This question is directed at making sure we are clear on what LaRouche means by physical time. When we discussed increases in relative energy flux density as a principle vital to all economic planning, one of the things that we discussed at some length was the importance of the distinction between increases themselves and the rate of increase. It would be helpful if you could say something about the distinction. Then the next item, such increases can only come about, it would seem, as a result of willful human action. Do you agree? If so, could this essentially serve as a basic definition of human anti-entropy? And finally, does, for instance, an increase in the rate of increase of relative energy flux density at least approximate what LaRouche is referring to as physical time?
Well, I guess I can just start with taking up some of this. Obviously, there's a lot in the question, and we'll actually be releasing some material over the next weeks that I think will get at it a bit more. So I probably have to want to extend the dialogue a bit further than just right here. But for example, just taking up some of the points. I mean, the idea of whether or not the universe itself has a mind. Somewhat implied in even asking the question is that the human mind is other than the universe. That somehow there's universe and then there's human beings in the universe. As opposed to the idea that Mr. LaRouche has developed of man as of the universe. That it really is, it's one process. That, in a sense, man is the manifestation of the self-conscious expression of creativity in the universe, but for the universe. That it, in other words, you can't separate the two. That what we see, it's a necessary development. That what man will do is to create new states of existence in the universe, to introduce new sets of relationships among principles in the universe, to do things to bring about changes which are lawful and necessary for the universe itself, but which could only come about as an act, a self-conscious, willful act on the part of creative man. So the fact that creative man is of the universe is not other than to say that the universe is a creative process, that the universe is creative because man is creative. And the only way that man is able to act in the universe is through that creativity. And it gets back to what we brought up earlier of getting at this notion of the substance of the universe being metaphor. That notion is really addresses that metaphor is not just a human invention which allows us to understand a universe which is otherwise opaque to us. That, this is sort of the Kantian idea, that we can't really access the real universe. We can just come up with these little tricks that we use among human beings which enable us to seemingly perform certain tasks and do certain things, but really there's some wall between the universe and man's mind. Mm-hmm. What we're getting at is that no, it's really the same substance. Right. That creativity is the substance of the universe, is the substance of the human mind. Mm-hmm. We're just in a process of constantly unfolding and becoming more and more, having more and more power and sort of self-conscious control over this creative process.
Which is if you drop the reductionist thesis, it's fraudulent. It doesn't work. There's never been a case of successful reductionism in any kind of efficient way. Mm-hmm. There's never been a case. Obviously, there's never been possible, never will be possible to reduce life and living processes to non-living phenomena. Never has been, and never will be a way to reduce, to produce cognitive activity from simple living activity. You can't get those. There's no way to build up to these principles. The principles operate as gestalts. They're ones. You can derive from them the lower levels, in the same way as you can take a curve and you can find an intersection, find a point, but you can't build a curve up from points. There's never a way to build upward from the bottom up in the universe. If that's true, then you recognize, which is clearly simply true, then you realize, okay, well, cognition cannot exist as an epiphenomenon of other processes.
Right.
So therefore, even when you destroy the substrate for cognitive things, that idea for that the gestalt of cognition had to exist as someplace prior to the actual carrier for the cognition. Mm-hmm. So prior to the human body, you had to have the principle of human creativity had to exist prior to the human body.
Right.
Now you ask, where is it? Where is it before you've got the singular human individuals appearing on the planet? You see it in the fact that man's mind, once it appears, is that measure for the universe as a whole. That somehow, no matter what you have, what question you ask that universe as a whole, man's mind is its measure, using principles of irony, principles of metaphor. That isomorphism between the two, between man and then the creative process that governs the universe, is, again, real, clearly definable. It's a necessary scientific principle without which you have no other principle. And it is what you get expressed in healthier theologies as the principle of man being made in the image of the Creator.
Right, right. Because part of the problem there is it gets back to the same space-time linearization problem. That we say, oh, well, we see from some idea of a timeline, man came along at a later point in time, and therefore came out of a process that preceded man.
Yeah, right.
As opposed to recognize, well, that which is unique to man, creativity, is something which is universal, which itself is what creates this shadow that we call time.
Right.
In the same way with space, there's sort of the idea that, okay, when we get an image of the Earth and man on Earth, we have this image of this is in this big thing called space, and that we are bound by the space. But you can invert it the way you can do with a simple geometric example that we've looked at with, say, a sphere or something. If you have a sphere, you can draw a very little circle on the sphere and say, well, is this little circle bound by this big sphere outside of it? Or could you not say that that same little circle is actually what's bounding the entire larger area of the sphere? And in the same way, even though it may, from a simple reductionist standpoint, seem like man, the earth, life are inside this very large, extensive universe, rather you invert the process and say what's ontologically the higher reality, that in fact it's man and life which bound the universe as a whole, that we are the boundary condition of the process, or creativity is the boundary condition of the process. But it's a boundary condition which itself is also a principle of change. It's not a fixed boundary condition.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And I'd like to group two questions that have come in together because they're on exactly the same subject. The first is a very short question from Israel Fajardo, who's currently watching in Houston, Texas. And the subject is immortality and society. He says, touching on the subject of human immortality, how is that expressed in society? Is it just that you are remembered, or is it that you ensure or have ensured the continual existence of mankind? And the second question is from a member of the audience who's become increasingly active. We heard from him during the last Basement webcast, specifically on the subject of linking Ireland to the Arctic Development Project through the Arctic Circle to Russia and China, and also on the subject of deep-sea astrobiology, studying chemosynthetic extremophiles. And he has a rather long question. I'm going to read a part of it. He says, hello, Sky and Cody. The LaRouche Irish science team is working on part 2 of our paper on the economic revival of Ireland. Part 2 will be even bolder than the first part, as we fully intend to prevent the Irish people from being cuckolded by the British Empire. Just a few days ago, the mudflaps for the Empire and the Irish government have conceded that Ireland could have a referendum on the mad EU proposals, but that Irish citizens would have to choose between staying in the euro or going back to the British pound sterling. Rubbish. We are going to LaRouche's policy, and we are going to the Arctic. We are turning the world upside down, and we are acting as instruments to end this oligarchical domination which only ever leads to war. Our friends are in Russia and China and that America which we are sure shall soon be once Obama is gone. Nice. In 1905, Sinn Féin founder and father of the Irish Republic, Arthur Griffith, convened a national council and outlined a program which included protectionism through harbor boards, a national bank, a mercantile marine, a proper transit system, and afforestation to raise the mean temperature of Ireland by 4 degrees and thus render the soil doubly fruitful. He taught the Irish to go with the American system policies of list and carry. We are extending this to LaRouche's crucial policies, which bring us to not only the easier earthly solutions, but also the galactic challenges which face us now. Today, under the insane oligarchical policies, young people are emigrating from Ireland in the thousands. This reminds us that in the 1830s, the population of Ireland was approaching 9 million, and it was estimated that the country could comfortably accommodate a population of 20 million. In the 1840s, during An Gorta Mór, the Great Famine, some 1.5 million human beings died of starvation and disease in Ireland in 4 years, while more than 1 million attempted to emigrate, half of which perished among the infamous coffin ships. In the century that followed, the population declined further to little over 4 million, and even today has far from recovered, standing at just 6.5 million. To put a stop to this destruction, we are proposing not only deep-sea exploration and the development of ports which will serve Arctic shipping and exploration, but also the revival of Ireland's destroyed shipbuilding industry by initiating the building of icebreakers for our nation and her friends among other nations to use to ply the Arctic waters. Now his question is this. Mr. LaRouche and the Basement have been developing the idea of non-linear time as opposed to clock time. We are bold enough to echo Arthur Griffith's statement. He said, quote, "If we realize the duties and responsibilities of the citizen and discharge them, we shall win. It is the duty of a free man to live so that his country may be the better of his having lived." So I would ask Sky and Cody, is the ability to have a passionate connection to the geniuses of a nation and their ideas across history, and the intention to apply such ideas in a Promethean manner, the way that we can tell what is the meaning of nonlinear time?
Thanks. Super quick on that. Yeah. I mean, to both, this, I think, makes the point that hopefully it's been clear from the discussion that immortality is not something that happens after you die. Again, as Cody made the point just now, the very notion of before and after in that sense in time is amazingly simplistic and doesn't apply to mind. This is an artifact. That kind of before and after is an artifact of the Newtonian conception of time. The ontology of the human conception of time is in exactly what the second question brings up, what we've called before the simultaneity of eternity, which is that in your lifetime you are in a dialogue, an active dialogue in the moment with, from the standpoint of mind, with personalities who from the standpoint of body and from the standpoint of sense perception are no longer here, whose physical bodies you can't be in contact with, but you're in direct contact with their mind. So again, if you want to look at the topology of time from that sense, the topology, in the same way as we're looking at the globe and you're seeing the connections here, close and far, depends on something else entirely than the actual geography of the planet. It's not simply the geography, it's man's actions on it. In real physical time, the relationship between human minds, the distance between minds is defined by principle. You've got in the same way society is a unified relationship among minds, where that unity is defined by principle. What unifies a nation, what unifies any people, people are unified around an idea or around a principle. That forms their closeness or their distance. The same thing in time. And that way you can be closer to a personality who is physically distant from you in the thousands of years. You can be closer to people who are personalities who have yet to be born for thousands of years, and to personalities who were born hundreds and thousands of years ago than you are to somebody who's standing right immediately next to you. That's a whole other kind of interconnectivity there. There's a whole other topology there. That's the basis for human immortality. It's not something that happens once you're dead. It's reflected in, if people were to ask for the sense perceptual shadow of it, the shadow would be, yes, your works. That's a shadow. Your memory, that's a shadow. This is what you experience. You say, well, I'm not really talking to that person. I'm reading their book. Or I'm thinking about their memory. And these things, but those are your sense perceptual ability to reflect what ontologically is your direct communication and connection, your actual interaction there. That's the topology of the real space-time. What you see down here is a projection of it. So that means that your immortality is something that you work for in your lifetime, you maintain in your lifetime. Schiller has a beautiful metaphor for it, where he says that it's a road. If you can call a road that which upon which you've already reached your destination for as long as you're walking on it. I add that as soon as you stop walking on it, you're infinitely far from your destination. That it's the ability to recognize process as substance, and to give that the actual ontological significance. In that's when you've managed to transcend body and reach mind. That's when you've recognized your real immortality. And again, this is not something at some later future point in time. This is something that transcends all of time in the same way as this concept of the simultaneity of eternity does. It has you bear the same relationship to time in that way as a creator must, where the creator of the universe does not exist before time in the sense of some moment before the first moment. The creator exists before time in the sense of preceding creation by necessity. In that sense, it's something that transcends time in the way eternity is discussed. Eternity is discussed versus forever in the Parmenides dialogue. That's the same relationship which the self-conscious human mind has to time. And again, in that is where you find immortality.
Now, I would just add, just briefly, just to punctuate it, that as has been the theme and will continue to be the theme, immortality is metaphor. That by participating in this quality of metaphor, whether it's through the development of poetry, whether it's through reliving a metaphor developed by another, whenever you participate in metaphor, you participate in the very substance of the universe, the creative substance of the universe. And creativity is not bound by space as we conceptualize space. Creativity is not bound by time as we conceptualize simply time. So immortality is really that. It's the participation in the creative process. And in participating in the creative process, in expressing a quality of metaphor, you've achieved something which transcends and is before and after space, time as we simply conceive it. So it's not a simple remembrance, but it's a participation in the creative process which is not bound by anything but the creative process itself. And I think that is the challenge before all of us, is that if we want to get out of the current crisis, the existential crisis facing mankind, facing the planet, and in many ways it may be an existential crisis for creativity in the universe as a whole, that we have to begin more and more to participate in this process of creativity, to participate in metaphor, to move mankind's identity to that of an immortal, creative one. And so I think we'll just turn it over to Matt for closing remarks.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Sky. Thank you very much, Cody. As I said, there have been a lot of questions that have come in, even more than we had time to get to today. And as people might have seen, there's a regular feature on our website now, which is the Basement Mailbag, which is a regular weekly discussion taking up questions that we didn't get to answer here today during the live event. This event will be archived on the LaRouche PAC website, and it will be broadcast via the LPAC TV stream in the coming days. So thank you, everybody who did participate in the event today. What Lyndon LaRouche has chosen to make very clear at this current moment is that we are entering into very dangerous days ahead. Over the coming days, we are maybe hours away from the beginning of a thermonuclear war in potential, and we are definitely at a point at which this transatlantic financial system cannot continue to survive. So the situation is such that we here at LaRouche PAC have publicly declared that we will be on watch and we will be on full mobilization until the new year and beyond. So stay tuned to LaRouche PAC TV. We'll be streaming this this webcast in the future days on the LPAC TV live stream. And if you still have questions, send them to info.larouchepac@gmail.com. info.larouchepac@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and stay tuned to LPAC TV.